Department of Theological Studies at Concordia University in Canada in Montreal. And he's been studying religions and violence in religion for several years. And Carl Matthews works at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, also at Concordia University, and he focuses on mass atrocity prevention, global threats, international security, and terrorism. So, Laura, perhaps you want to start? Ladies first.
Hello, everyone. Laura, as I got introduced. I'm a freelance journalist and working for Nuba Reports for 1.5 years now. And in the last year, I've been to Khartoum and to the Nuba Mountains in Sudan. And every time I'm coming back from Sudan and I'm like reporting for the German media from there, especially after I came back from the Nuba Mountains, I got asked, so can you please focus a bit more on like the source of the conflict, like the two religions fighting against each other? I'm like, but wait, no. This conflict is like way more complex than like just Christians and Muslims fighting against each other. And then I was like trying to explain the conflict or the sources, or like how I see, like as an outsider, the sources of the conflict to the editors, and trying to like wrap this up in like the few words I had like writing my little reports. And I came across the concept of the crisis of identity, which still happens, or which is the source of the conflict, or which might be the source of the conflict in Sudan. And for me, that explains it quite well. Like how this conflict came by like the not embracing like the different identities this like huge country has. Yeah.
Thank you. Andre, do you want to?
My name is Andre Gagne. One of the issues pertaining to this particular panel that strikes me as something that needs to be addressed is we are at a point where we are seeing the results of terror attacks. Here, we're going to talk about our situation here in the West as having the potential of actually creating fractures in our societies and divisions in our societies. I recently spent a month in Paris, and I had the privilege of meeting Gilles Kepel, who is an eminent scholar and has become a friend. And we were talking about the situation in France and how in France there is this danger of this fracture. And it's often related, and a lot of people talk about the issue of what is called laïcité in France. This type of particular secularism that seems to be very stringent against religious expressions, especially in the public sphere. And of course, for Kepel, this is an issue, but there are other issues related to that. And I was talking to him about our situation in Quebec and in Canada. It's interesting that Marie was mentioning the fact that Canada seems to be such a welcoming place, but there has been a recent poll that shows that in the last year or two, there's been a spike in anti-Muslim sentiment by 61% in Canada. And in Quebec, we are dealing with situations around questions of identity politics, because people are reacting to issues around immigration and issues that they seem to identify as being a clash of values. And the thing is, there is a real danger for our societies in the West to fall prey to what I consider being the jihadist propaganda discourse, which is this idea that the West is actually in war against Islam. And if you look at the grievances that some of these people mentioned when they actually engage in terror attacks, either before engaging or after, when groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS claim these attacks. These grievances are often grievances related to what is happening with the coalition in these countries, and it's grievances essentially against the West. So if we are not careful as societies in the types of decisions we make with respect to policies that we put in place, or even reactions that we have towards these types of events, like reactions, even in Quebec. We had a very, very bad situation a couple of months ago. At the beginning of the year, there's been a shooting in a Quebec mosque. We heard about the situation in London yesterday. These types of reactions, far-right reactions, that can create divisions, and we need to be very, very careful, because the jihadist, I would say, propaganda or the jihadist narrative is to divide us. And we need to be very careful that our liberalism at one point does not become illiberal.
Okay.
Testing 1, 2, 3. All right, I'm on. I think back about two important books that were written in the early 1990s about where the world was going to go. One was Samuel Huntington and The Clash of Civilizations, who argued that the future conflicts of the world would be based on not natural resources, but really on culture and identity. And we also had Francis Fukuyama, who wrote The End of History, that liberal democracies were the end, that's what everyone wanted, that's where we're going. And now in 2017, I'm not too sure who was right. I see places where we see democracies rolling back. We're seeing the rise of liberal democracies, or liberal authoritarianism, or whatever you want to call it. And then we also see more and more of these conflicts breaking out across the globe that are based on religion and different cultural practices. And I think if we look at the rise of extremism, I think the first thing we have to realize that it's a global phenomenon. Journalists like to report if there's a terrorist attack in France, or report on something in Nigeria, or the recent attack in the southern city of the Philippines that's still under attack by Abu Sayyaf, is that we tend to look at these cases in a national perspective, but when you take a global perspective, you start to get certain themes, and I think that's very important. And I think it's not just the religious extremism that's rising, but we're seeing a rise in right-wing extremism, and that can be expressed both at individual levels of individuals and societies, like the attack yesterday we saw in London that looks like it's a right-wing extremist, an anti-Muslim attack. But we also see the rise of right-wing governments. Look at Hungary, which in a way is against immigration. It doesn't want to become multicultural. It's pushing back against multiculturalism. It's against a lot of liberal freedoms, freedom of the press, NGOs, gay rights. There's a rise of these governments that actually see liberalism as a threat to their national identity and potentially putting their citizens in danger. And they look at the West, Western Europe, particularly France, the UK, and they actually say, we don't want to become that. And they're pushing back against it. And actually, in some cases, they're actually getting supported by Vladimir Putin. And Putin's Russia is supporting quite a few of these right-wing governments. So we said Marine Le Pen's party, or the Geert-Wilders party in the Netherlands. So this is emerging as a global phenomenon with different interests. But generally, we see there's a real pushback on mass migration. And I would say mass migration is, if you look historically, if you look at the rates of migration to the West, it is quite new. If you look at the United Kingdom, they always had migration about 50,000 people a year. When the Labour government came in the mid-1990s, it went up to 250,000, and we're seeing that in Canada too. So this great movement of peoples resettling in other countries with different cultural backgrounds is in some ways very, very new. And there are people that are questioning, has that gone too fast? Should we slow it? Is it should we continue immigration patterns when we have economic downturns? These are questions that are developing. And we're also seeing, I say, a pushback on multiculturalism. It's Germany, the Netherlands, the UK have said we don't want to accept multiculturalism anymore as a model, because they say that we're not integrating our immigrants into our society. It's really only Canada that's still the multicultural cheerleader across the world. And this wider debate that's happening, the rise of these extremisms, I would say it's now shaping up to be a debate about which countries want to be open and which want to be closed. Mm. So which ones that see just being open and having unlimited immigration and laissez-faire approach to all of that is good for the long run. Others that say in the long run, it might be against our interests. So we're seeing this debate, open, closed societies. And I think, that we're seeing that, yes, there's a challenge of transnational terrorism. Terrorism is not, the terrorism we're seeing that really comes from the jihadists, like Andre were talking about, this is transnational. We have, in my country, Canada, we have a high number of people that, first time in our history, that have gone off to join ISIS. We've had a major attack in Dhaka, Bangladesh, that resulted in the deaths of many Japanese and Italian tourists. It was a Canadian that did that. So people are waking up and saying, well, what's going on here, and how can we reduce this, or at least to bring some healing to our society? And we're seeing, I think, which is fundamental, the most fundamental aspect that I think we're seeing today is the polarization between the right and the left. I think on the issues of migration, on multiculturalism, on counterterrorism policies, the left and the right politically seem to be almost like the Red Sea in biblical times, separating, not coming together. And I think that is deeply troubling, because if we have all these problems that we're trying to deal with, and our political elite, and our not just our political elite, but our media elite and our cultural elite are actually having polarized positions where we can't even have a dialogue anymore. And I think one of the sessions talked about earlier about Donald Trump's America shows that. There was a person that said that they refused to identify Donald Trump as the president of the United States, called him number 45. I mean, to me, that symbolizes that, yes, someone won the election, you don't like the results, but to just in your mind mentally pretend that person doesn't exist or has a seat of power is troubling. And I think that symbolizes what's happening in the West and also in other countries as well. It's not just the West. So a couple comments before we go into a wider group discussion. I would think one key lesson, I think, and I say this as a former staff member of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. I worked helping IDPs, helping refugees. There is more and more statistics that show that uncontrolled migration can cause some concern when public sees that that the government has lost control. Barack Obama was in Montreal just last week, first speech he gave in Canada since losing the presidency. I think he got paid about $700,000 for that speech. I mean, lucky guy. But he mentioned this. He said, listen, we have to also realize that migration, if migration is not handled in an orderly manner, it can result in these polarizing debates. And he would know that with the 11 million mostly Mexican migrants that enter the U.S. And illegally and don't have papers. That's become a hot button topic in the U.S. And we're seeing that now as well in Europe with the flow of refugees that 40% from Syria, but from all over Central Asia and parts of Africa, that this is a burning issue. And I would also say one last point is that the laissez-faire approach to migration and integration poses risk as well. I think Western societies need to probably think longer and harder about why are we having some problems? Why are we having problems integrating people? Why are we seeing some violence? And how can we do a better job? Should we put more resources towards it? Are there cultural issues? But I think we really have to have deeper discussions, but we have to have the honesty among civil society, among our political elite, to talk about this. Because if we don't, if we brush it under the rug, the problems might just get bigger. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to stay on the issue of migration and immigration, because that's what we see. If you look at the discourse of the Front National or in the Netherlands of Trump, the immigration seems to be, it's the main part of their argument. And so I'd like to you take on this, on the link between the rise of populism, the fear of immigration, and where's this coming from? Are we seeing a global kind of crisis of identity? What does it mean to be German? What does it mean to be French or Quebecois, for example? Because, for example, in Canada, as a result of Trump's, claim that he's going to close down borders, we've seen a lot of refugees from the U.S. coming into Canada. By foot, and there was certainly a lot of fear. I mean, Canada has welcomed a lot of refugees via plane, but there was this election, right? And now they're coming through the U.S. border to Canada, and suddenly people were afraid. So where is this coming from? Why are right-wing parties, for example, so popular these days?
I'll take a stab at that. I think there is a direct correlation between terrorism we've seen in the West and migration patterns. I mean, there was a study done from one of the top schools in the United Kingdom that said every time there was a religious-inspired terrorist attack in the UK, support for the far right, for the the British National Party or the UKIP surged. So there is a link there. There's a symbiotic link between religious-inspired terrorism and the rise of the far right in the West. But I think, you know, I think Europe is very different. You know, in Canada, we have two oceans on each side of us. We have the US from the south of us. We actually, our migration patterns are very, very diverse. We get people from China, the Philippines, like it's a really mix. I think in Europe, it's different. There's been a surge of migration from the Maghreb and North Africa, and so you're having more of group politics form. I mean, we accept immigrants as individuals, but when they settle in a country, they develop group identities, and so we're seeing that. But I do think there is a connection to some of the violence we've seen, and I also think because of social media. I mean, you know, what happened in northern Nigeria 10, 15 years ago, you know, we'd have to wait for 2 weeks to read in a newspaper. Now in social media, we find out right away if there's a Boko Haram attack, or if there's an attack against a Nairobi shopping center by Al-Shabaab, or if Yazidis are being imprisoned in northern Iraq. So we see this, and I think a lot of the public is making these connections and wondering what's going on. And so there's maybe an irrational fear, but it's a fear nonetheless that I think is driving part of the narrative.
Yeah.
Just to maybe surf a bit on what you're saying, I think the issue with the far right, especially in relation to immigration and in reaction, I would say, to terror attacks, it's often ignorance with respect to what constitutes, for example, Islam. It's clear. The situation, for example, what we had in Quebec City, the mosque attack in Quebec City, people that do embrace those extreme views can't make any kind of distinction between Muslims that are integrated in our societies, that, you know, they learn the language, they're part of society, they contribute, they worship peacefully, and jihadists. They make no distinctions there. You see, so there is a situation where education is needed so that we can kind of make sense out of all of this, because it's irrational fear. It's at one point, and we're talking about terrorist attacks. People fear. We had this even in Canada, the reaction to Syrian refugees, but we know that terror attacks are committed for the most part by homegrown terrorists. It's not a Syrian that's gonna come in and actually perpetrate an attack. Of course, you have social media and ISIS that you know propagates the idea that we've infiltrated through migration flows and that we're going to attack you. Of course, that plays on fears. But what we've seen in reality is that people here, people that are living in our Western liberal democracies, at one point become dissatisfied with liberalism and turn to illiberal actions. So the question we have to ask ourselves as societies is, what makes that so attractive? How come for certain young people the jihadist narrative becomes a curriculum for them? It becomes something that's more appealing to anything that we have to offer here in the West. That's an issue that we have to deal with.
I feel like also that they have all like easy answers. They have like a solution to everything, and the solution is very easy. Like, we close the borders, or we do this and we do that, and you're going to be like, it's going to be fine. Like, yeah, I think that's why they're so attractive to like so many people, because they have like an easy answer to everything, while like other politicians, like, they talk and people might not understand everything they're saying, and it's like a harder way, and it's like a long distance to go. But these right-wing parties sometimes like have a very short, very straight solution.
I'd like you to perhaps stay on that, and like to comment on the situation in Sudan. How does identity play out over there, and what's the discourse in Khartoum, for example, compared to the, you know?
Well, the discourse in Khartoum, like from my experience, is not very openly about like the identity of the Sudanese, if there is something like that. Like it's so the conflict is between like the Arab identity and the African identity, and this conflict is not talked about in Khartoum openly, as far as I experienced it, but. You can see that conflict, like in like a woman saying, "Well, I can dress without a headscarf because like I'm from the Arab tribe. I'm from an Arab tribe, and like I'm privileged. I can do it." By like girls trying to take away like their skin, or like not the color of their skin, like by bleaching, like heavily bleaching. And I have seen bleaching before, but like that was like a different scale of like skin bleaching and like putting makeup on top of it. But I've also seen like artists who like sing about like that they're African girls and that they're proud of their African identity, or like in photos. So you can see it in art, but like I didn't hear like an open discussion about like what's our identity, what's the Sudanese identity.
So is there more like tribal identities to it as well, or does that play a role?
I guess it plays a role. They would like rather like take an example from the Nuba Mountains. So first, like everyone there identifies as a Nuba, like which are like, I don't know, I think like 90 different tribes, or like 99 or something like that, different tribes. But like then when you get like more into this, like asking more and more, then they start to identify with like, no, I'm a Toro, and I'm a Moro, and I'm a Kualip, or whatever. So like, first of all, they are all Nuba, and they have the Nuba identity, and they're proud of their Nuba identity, but then they also have like on a different level the identity of their tribe.
Okay. Andre, you were mentioning before, you know, the issue of laïcité, and often laïcité is like versus, you know, multiculturalism. Some say religious extremism and homoculturalism is a result of laïcité, and the other ones say, oh, it's a result of multiculturalism, what we see in London and in England. But like to perhaps you to comment on that a little bit.
This is a very complex question, because when I was in France, I also met another colleague that was telling me that the situation in France, laïcité, is really not like our own secularism, even in Canada or even in Britain or even in the US, that considers themselves as secular. Laïcité for him was almost like an ideology. It's almost like the new religion for people in France. And of course, he wasn't saying that this was the only issue. He was saying there's other issues related to the rise of extremism. But laïcité can sometimes be an impediment. In Canada, as you know very well, we are a bit experiencing both types of secularism. Canada, you have Quebec. It's very, very close to the French laïcité, at least in its own understanding, in its own identity. Tries to model itself, not completely as the French model, but models itself because it's closer to its roots to France. And you have the rest of English Canada that's more reflective of what we see in Britain, or not in the US. I think the US has the role of religion, even if the U.S. says that there is a clear separation between state and church, we see that there's still a strong role of religion in politics. But I think the issue of terror, it's not about laïcité or not. Of course, jihadist propaganda is going to talk about that. But again, it comes back and it boils down to Bin Ladenism. What Bin Laden first put out, this idea that it's the values of the West. It's everything that the West represents. It's the West that's in war against Islam. It's making these these types of totalitarian declarations, where you engulf everybody. The West is this, and Islam is this. And what I try to do as a professor, even myself as a teacher, is you can't talk about Islam as one thing, and even the West as only one thing. You have to talk about Islams, plural, and you have to talk about various models in the West. So I don't think that laicity is necessarily an issue, because we've seen terror attacks in countries that seem to be much more open, multiculturally speaking.
Cal, you were speaking about two books that you know, The Clash of Civilization and then Fukuyama and liberalism. And I was listening to some of the comments following the attack last night, and one of the guys who was there on the street, he said, no, I'm scared of actually showing that I'm a Muslim. I'm scared of showing, my religion. What are we seeing? Are we seeing, because ISIS pretends that we're seeing a clash of civilization, and then at the same time there's a lot of criticism of liberalism and these values. I'd like you to go further on that.
Well, I think first we have to recognize that ISIS as an organization and what they're doing on the ground in parts of Syria, Iraq. These are not exactly Boy Scouts. They're committing genocide. They're just destroying UNESCO World Heritage sites. They're enslaving Yazidis. They're attacking other religious minorities. The way they're waging war is against every normal human rights principle. It's against the Geneva Convention. So these guys are not, or the organization and the ideology is one that is very destructive, and one is very violent and expansionist. But second, when they put out propaganda on the internet urging people to commit violent acts, and people do it, they can't turn around and say, "See, we showed you." They're in a way are orchestrating this violence. And I'm actually surprised that in the UK, because the UK has had 3 major attacks, one against the parliament, once at that concert that killed quite a few young girls and women, and then another stabbing just about 2 weeks ago. So this violent terrorism is eventually going to create a response within society, and this is what ISIS wants to do. They've said they want to turn. They want to create a civil war in Western states of the majority non-Muslims against the Muslim minority. So we have to recognize this is what they're trying to do, and so we can't fall into that trap. But this group they're extremely dangerous, and they're not snowflakes. They're not Boy Scouts. I think deep down they're very dangerous people, and their actions and the history books will showcase that.
So let's say you want to give advice to Macron, Justin Trudeau, but also future leaders who are trying to deal with these problems in order to avoid falling into dangerous nationalisms and totalitarianisms. So what kind of recommendations would you give them instead of, because a lot of them are putting their heads in the sand. We see it with Justin Trudeau. I know internationally he's very well liked, but
I think there's going to be some uncomfortable discussions that are going to need to be had in Western democracies. One that people have been urging Canada to have, and it's coming from many in our Muslim community itself, saying beware of foreign meddling in religious affairs. So there's concern about Saudi Arabia spends a lot of money in certain mosques or religious establishments. There's concern about the spread of Wahhabism, not the most tolerant aspect. The Ahmadis are saying they're asking for help. The Sufis in Canada, the people are concerned. So that's one. I think we have to be very careful about states interfering in religious affairs in other states. 2, though, I think we have to really build a civic nationalism. It's great for people to embody a religious identity, but if you embody your religious identity only and you don't become part of the majority of the population, that creates friction. So I think our leaders in civil society and religious groups, everyone actually, I think it's a responsibility to build this civic nationalism, the civic identity. It's not ethnic nationalism, but civic nationalism is a force for good to create a common cause. And I think we have to do that. It's the key to internal stability.
I feel like we as Europeans or as Germans, we have to embrace like this diversity, because like in the end, like we can only get richer by it, right? Like the more diversity you have, the more resources you have, the more, yeah. So I feel like we should like embrace this diversity, and from all sides, like people who are arriving should embrace the diversity, like which they're finding here as well. But like we have to make the first step. We have to embrace the diversity we're like, which is reaching here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. Eh? The politician that will be able to really not fall into any type of extremes, we're still waiting to see who he is or who she is, because that's the issue. It's not putting your head in the sand, pretending that there's absolutely no problems, and at the same time, it's not embracing identity politics. And this is a very, very fine line. But I think it's naming things for what they are. It's being clear when we talk about jihadism or terror attacks, it's being clear what kind of Islamist extremism we're dealing with, but without necessarily saying, okay, this has absolutely nothing to do with the Islamic religion or tradition. No, these people legitimize their actions through that. It's not saying, no. The problem is sometimes we attribute to these people actions or motives that they do not recognize themselves. So let's listen to what they say about what their actions are really like. And to come back to a point that Kyle was mentioning, I think we're probably too much interventionist in those countries. We're not going to change the way people are. We're not going to change their cultures. We can of course promote democracy, but there are countries that will, they have a way of understanding their world, their reality, and it's not the West that's going to change that in any shape or form. Like the West coming in and is going to save. The West is going to save Iraq. The West is going to save Afghanistan. It doesn't mean that we can't help out, but to think that we're going to change things, we can't. In some places there is democracy. Democracy is not always reflective of the types of democracies that we experience in the West, liberal democracies. But there's sometimes democracies that are illiberal, and we have to kind of work with that. And it's not an easy thing. So this is why I'm saying it's difficult not to fall into extremes, and it's to really, really make sure that we check our reactions, our reactions are not polarizing in any shape or form, and our discourses are not polarizing in any shape or form. As for identity, there are multiple identities. A person is not just one person. You can have a religious identity, you can have an ethnic identity, a national identity. There's different identities, and it's actually speaking on that and not shutting down these other identities that people have, where they can probably express those other facets of their own identities.
Thank you. I'd really like now to have kind of your comments and your questions, so please don't hesitate to come forward, because you're from all over the world, so we'd like to know what's going on in your own country and the kind of questions that you see. So please go ahead. Sir.
So come to the front or just stay here?
As you wish.
Yeah, so I'm Adonis Al-Khalid. I'm a Syrian TV and radio presenter, and since like a year and a half I live in Germany. I came as a refugee. And since my experience here in Germany, it's like I really see many things I didn't see in my like in my country, even in Syria. For example, the first day I arrived to Germany, to Hamburg, I got to meet like a Syrian family who know me from TV, and they tried to help me because I just wrote it on Facebook that I am in Germany. And I was hosted for one night, and I got to know many other people at that night, and outside also their home. And this was the first time in my life I see a woman, for example, a Syrian woman, giving the tea behind the door because she's not allowed, for example, to to show up for a stranger who is me. Yeah. So I mean, I was just talking with my mom, and I said I saw something in Germany which we didn't see in our country. It is there maybe in some places, but it is really so much here in Germany. And then I asked, and they are all Germans. They all have the passports, and they are all, they are part of this society, and at the end of the day. So what I wanted to say is that there is a blame on us as Syrians, as people who have also immigration background, to show the, maybe we always hear the real Islam. So what is the real Islam? Just can somebody show up and speak about it? Or also, for example, in the streets, or did we see any demonstration in the streets, for example, against terrorism, but from Muslims, not from Europeans? As Europeans went to the Bahnhofs or like main stations, and they welcomed us, so we are not taking our part in a way. I just feel, we are not doing what we should do, because here in Germany, anything you do in the street, you demonstrate legally, and you express your ideas, it is so welcome. Even in the media, they would celebrate us. But where we are, I mean, like, I don't find any one of us who's just trying to tell something about the real Islam, because as you have just mentioned, it's Islams in plural, so it's like many Islams. So just we hear about extremists, terrorists, and we hear about like those who are in between, and those who just celebrate their religion at home. So I mean, we don't see the other face or the real face, as many they always say. Even they don't condemn, for example, the terror attacks sometimes. So I just feel like we are blamed a little bit, and it's nice to confront each other and just to tell that everything as it is. And I also want to mention another point, as you also mentioned in Canada, because we were in the radio station where I worked, me and Noel immigrated to Canada, Quebec, and me in Germany. So sometimes we just exchange opinions, what is happening there and what is happening here. I'm not sure if it's really fair to compare 35,000 Syrian refugees in Canada to 1.3 million refugees in Germany.
Especially since we select them, so.
And also like it was really selection in it. So maybe it's just like choose the best who are already kind of able to be integrated in the society. But here in Germany, the doors were so open. You didn't know who came in. And me and my little brother, where we were on the road of immigration, we had this conflict with some people in the road. Like we cannot consider them also like as part of our society, because they have also their opinions which I can't accept. And so this is, I think it's not fair, because Germany, for me, I can say that they are doing a great job. As a refugee, I just can say what they offered us till now, it's great opportunities, and it's a great chance. And I saw, for example, the Syrian Expa Philharmonic Orchestra. There are 80 Syrian musicians. I see Suriana. It's the first Syrian basketball team, and the one who won for example, the European Youth Prize or something. I'm not sure of the name exactly, but it's also he's a Syrian. So when I see all those examples, it's fantastic. But at the other side, when we hear all this discussion about Islam and Islamophobia and xenophobia and all this hate of speech, we must also do something. So it goes back also to the same idea, like zusammen, like we together, in as they say in German.
Thank you so much. Does one of you want to comment?
I'll just make a short comment. I agree with you. I mean, our government in Canada has, they did a very good humanitarian gesture. They brought in 35,000 to 40,000 Syrian refugees, and they took a lot of credit for that. They're not doing much now, but I think compared to Germany, it's a drop in the bucket. So I do think Germany has done a lot more than my country has.
I just want to quickly say something about the what you say, that there was like no demonstration of like Muslims against terrorism or something. I think like I'm not sure, on Saturday or on Sunday there was like a demonstration, but like the biggest the Verband. Can someone help? Yeah, like for like they, yeah, exactly, yeah, they didn't want to take part of it in it. So, and there is like a discussion. There was like a discussion about this in the media as well, as I can see.
Can I just add also, sometimes what I see is that Muslim communities feel pressured to actually say something in relation to what's happening, to position themselves in relation to what's happening and denounce the violence, and sometimes even say this is not Islam, this is not the true Islam. But there's a danger, in a sense, even with respect to someone who is a Muslim and adheres to this tradition. There has been a lot of discussion in jihadist circles about the fact that ISIS declares takfir against other Muslims, saying that they are apostates, that they are not true Muslims. So when Muslim communities engage or say this is not the true Islam, there is a danger of actually doing what is not supposedly permissible to do. Wait, do you see? On saying, no, this is not the true Islam. So I think what you said was right. I think we need to be speaking in terms of the, Islams and the various sometimes manifestations like Christianities or Judaisms that manifest themselves in different ways. But you're right. There is a sense that, and sometimes I speak with Muslim friends. There is a sense of where people feel pressured to do something, or at least to say something as a Muslim that has not committed any of this, to almost take responsibility for that. And yeah, that's it.
For example, like after each terrorist attack,
you're expected. Eh?
Yeah, I mean,
that's
they
it.
just go in the tram, or you just go in the street, and you just feel you are accused. Like somebody
know,
would
but
point out at you.
that's it, and it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense because it's not you.
But in indirect way, it's affecting our image because we are
Of course.
all together, like
Of course.
refugees,
Of
immigration
course.
background.
Of course. In the sense, if there's something that has to be said, is actually to denounce this exaggeration, this misappropriation, this misinterpretation, this decontextualization of this tradition. So it's to say that. It's to engage in this kind of dialogue.
I see other questions over there. This one, he has his hand first, and then over there.
Thank you so much. My name is Aqil. I come from Afghanistan, but I'm based in Germany. I'm an independent analyst. Interesting discussions. Thanks for the nice presentation. I have slightly a different view about Muslims conducting or have to conduct demonstrations about what happens, or what a bunch of bad people doing something and we have to go to the roads and say, oh, that was not us. Sorry. I think this is the responsibility of mankind, everybody. It's Christianity or it's Muslims, whoever. So whatever happens, people should demonstrate, not Muslims. Because I, as a Muslim, I don't consider them to be part of me, because their belief is absolutely something else. And by the way, as you said, that Canada is also concerned about those immigrants who are extremists and fundamentalists, and you also gave an example of what they did at the end of the day. And the venue or the place where they conducted that terror attack was Bangladesh. It's a Muslim country. So who should be like responsible for that every day and go on the roads and say, hey, we are sorry, we are not. When something happens, I will go with my non-Muslim friends and demonstrate. So I would have this idea to detach this from this view that it belongs to Muslims and they should raise their voices. No, everybody should raise their voice.
Yeah.
I give one slight example. Like you remember maybe that it was, I think, 2011, correct me if I'm wrong, what happened in Norway by Anders Behring.
Yeah.
I think his name was Anders Behring. What happened in Norway was the biggest terror attack after Madrid bombing in 2004. So he was a Christian, and also the police confirmed that before he committing that barbaric attack, he had posted something like, a person with firm faith is stronger than 100 who have self-interest. So there were some signs of a religious instinct in him to have motivated him. But who talked about this? I mean, which Christian will accept that he was a Christian, so we are sorry for that, or oh, let's denounce it? I think I wanted to give this command that it's the responsibility of everybody around the world to denounce them.
And you know, after we had the attack on the mosque in Quebec City, there was a big movement, especially in Montreal, where everybody got together and really condemned the attack.
And I assure you that if this happens repeatedly, I think the scenario will change. For example, there are some bombing attacks. I mean, this is repeatedly done in Iraq and Afghanistan, and some of them are not covered by the media because it's something which is really repeatedly done. So something which is unique and new, media goes for that. So what happened there, it's something which is not very usual, it's rare, but if it happens, I'm sure that the scenario will change slowly.
Yeah. I'd like to go to perhaps just a question, there are a bunch of gentlemen.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed. I'm from Jordan. I have actually a few remarks and some questions for you. I think it's very dangerous to have Muslims cornered in a position that they have to be on the defense whenever something happens, because I believe as human beings we're all in the same boat against those life haters. My question will be about hate speech. In your opinion, to what degree you believe hate speech is being deployed by such terrorist groups, and also on social media in particular? And what is the recipe, basically? Because we're now in the age of media freedoms, the internet, no control. I can tell you a story in Jordan last year. A prominent writer was killed for sharing a cartoon mocking the god of ISIS, or what they believe of God is. I believe he was demonized and he was assassinated on social media before actually he was killed before the court. And and many people even haven't seen that cartoon or haven't read what he wrote about that. In Jordan now, we have around 1.3 million Syrian brothers and sisters, and Jordan is the third poorest country in water. We're sharing resources, they're placing pressure on everything, but they're still our brothers and sisters. But again, even in Jordan now, we have recent studies showing that the media, by only focusing on the negative aspect and how they are basically placing pressure on the resources of Jordan and taking the jobs of Jordanians, we're kind of seeing more of a trend in the media, and that's actually contributing to more hate speech against them. So hate speech, what's the recipe? Thank you.
If I could, no, listen, I think there's a problem. I think with social media now, I mean, in the past, it was only really governments that could take control of like radio, newspaper broadcasting, TV, you name it, to actually, spread hate and demonize a group. Now anyone with a smartphone can do it. You have a Twitter account, you can start tweeting against anyone you don't like this person because of their faith or their religion, or against refugees. This is a growing problem, and I think we just saw, I think 3 days ago, Elizabeth May and Emmanuel Macron, France, they agreed to join forces to put more pressure on social media companies. The social media companies are now saying that they can't control it, so they're going to deploy artificial intelligence to actually AI to try to deal with this. But it's a growing problem, and I can tell you, I mean, we have in Canada, our hate speech laws are very, very clear. If you engage in directing somebody to commit violence towards a group, that is a hate crime. Criticizing immigration, that's a little bit different. That's not considered a hate crime, but it's a growing problem. I agree with you, and we've been pushing with this to try to get it on the global agenda for a couple of years now.
And there might be a difference, what you're saying. I think targeting individuals specifically and calling upon violence, and legitimately critiquing ideology, religious ideology or political ideology or whatever, legitimately critiquing that, that's part of free speech or debate. And it is becoming a problem, because if you start shutting down, and people are doing that, and companies are doing that, Facebook and Twitter, but you always have these other social media platforms. Now you have Telegram, which is encrypted, and people join, and there's a lot going on there, and you can't control that. So that becomes, that's going to be the challenge of the future. But I think we need to have clear, defined laws, and I think Canada is doing a great job in relation to that. But we need to draw the line where we can critique ideas. We can critique ideas. And in a sense, there's people that say, I saw a comment recently, just after the London mosque attack, on Twitter from a far-right individual that was saying we should ban the book that says kill all infidels, and there's a Quranic verse that talks about that. We should ban the book. So I have another person that on Twitter that just replies, and he puts verses of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. Let's ban that book too. Because you have that in traditions. It's there. It's not pretending it is not there, it's there. But how do we talk about it? How do we help people understand that there is a context to these discourses? And the problem with extremists is that they decontextualize these discourses and apply them directly to modern day situations, and that's what we have to target. That's what we have to do.
Whoa. There's a minute at the front over there.
Hello, everybody. My name is Usama, but not Bin Laden. I'm coming from Algeria. I'm a Muslim. I'm fasting, but I don't hate anybody in this room, and I will not attack anybody. And I'm a journalist and a scholar. I'm preparing a thesis of PhD. I'm working on the terrorism, extremism, and the speech, political speech, and the role of media as loudspeakers for terrorists. And this is a problem.
Yeah.
The fact that I'm coming from Algeria, it means that I know, or I lived the experience of Algerian people who knows the terrorism in 1990 and after, before everybody, I think, in this room, and unfortunately, we were alone, because people thought that terrorism is a local problem or phenomenon. But now we are talking, I think that everybody had understood, that it's a global problem, a global crime, and we have to work together in order to counter this. But what about the job of scholars? If we know that there is no one definition, common definition of terrorism. What is terrorism? What is extremism? Okay. Before 1998, members of ERA were terrorists, and after they were not. Before 1962, Front of Liberation of Algeria were terrorists. They were terrorists in the eyes of, in the view of French colonizer, but after, they are not. So what is terrorism exactly? I think if we don't reach or find a common definition of terrorism, we cannot counter it. Thank you.
Gentleman at the back, just behind you. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Asaf. I would like to talk about this topic from another perspective, probably from political philosophy. And here is also diversity and populism. It seems that they contract or in a contract, how can I say, contradictionary positions, but probably if you will look back to the modern life, or I mean the times after the Second World War, and populism here is a type of, how can I say, nationalism, and we see that time. I mean, in short, if I want to say that the terrorism and also the refugee flow in the 21st century is a part of the neoliberal economy system. It is a part of a neoliberal model. We cannot ignore that. We cannot focus on the, I mean, liberal and also the national level, I mean, the sovereign state, like we had after the Second World War and before that. And at the same time, we say that, okay, we should focus, and one of the panelists said a very, I mean, crucial sentence, and more diverse and more resources. This is exactly the point. When we, for example, in the West, when the Western governments, when the Western states are going to other countries just to, I mean, trans-Atlantic or trans-Pacific deals, and at the same time, they are searching for new resources for the West. At the same time, they should accept also that something happens there, because they open the world. It is not also. We have an example for that. For example, I pro-Trump person. I know Trump is at least honest with some comments. For example, yeah, for example, he is anti-protectionist, and he says that, he's protectionist, yeah, exactly, sorry. And at the same time, he's trying to do American first, and he will see that. And he's going to Saudi Arabia and has a deal, weapon deal, $110 billion. And at the same time, he says, we close the borders. And we see all of them are at the extent of, at the context of, at the same context. Closing the borders and focusing on America, and at the same time, American first, and bringing billions of dollars back home to the United States, and saying weapon. But we forget that if a war happens once again in the Middle East, what happened? The refugee, like what happened exactly right now in Iraq, in Syria, and so in the Spring Arab, in disaster Arab, sorry Arab friends, but I call it. Anyway, and we see that the flow of the refugees are coming, and somehow the terrorism, insecurity, we call it, and it is a part of, it is the nature of neoliberal economy when we focus on that. When we open the borders, okay, at the economic level we have this, we can say that the world is flat, but at political level, the world is not flat, at least because of the mountains of Afghanistan. This is just an example. We see that how the tourism or extremism or in the tribal areas everywhere. And we see that in the Kazakhstan area, in the north of China, here, and also the populist far right wings in Europe, and this insecurity. I don't want to title all of them terrorism, because when terrorism, it is also, we fantasize, and it is a part of the media, unfortunately, that we are trying to fantasize about everything, about diversity, about identity, about populism, about the nationalism. But if we look at that, we should see all aspects of one phenomenon. Sorry. Thank you.
The young lady over there. Need a woman in here.
Thank you. My name is Pradnya, and I'm in charge of a program by the Bosch Foundation called Media Ambassadors. I have a few remarks to what has already been said so far by a lot of esteemed colleagues around. I will try to look at it from a cultural perspective, because when you talk about integration and also diversity, you necessarily also have to address the issue of this fear of losing what is yours. Again, yours is in inverted commas. So a set of people who are fleeing war, or also economic migrants who are not necessarily fleeing war, they suddenly find themselves in the middle of a completely new context, not speaking the language, not understanding what is being said around them. And those are the people whose destinies have been decided upon by a completely unknown group of people. So it's this innate fear, and it's not only in Europe. In India we are seeing this. So a lot of young Indians who have resorted or voted for the right-wing party BJP, they are also getting carried away in the wave of populism, where suddenly they're talking about beef ban, which is one of the basic needs. You're trying to ban something which provides food to a huge amount of the population. So I think we also have to look at the cultural aspect of it when you talk about diversity, or even in Germany, for instance. The first wave of migrants that came around in the 60s and 70s of Turkish people, at that time the state did not make so many efforts in terms of integrating them. So if you see it, even today, a lot of Turkish families will have people or members in the family who do not speak German, as compared to a lot of Syrian immigrants who have come here only 2 years ago and can speak a decent amount of German. So I think that is also something that we need to address when we're talking about populism and extremism, and not only in terms of terrorism.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
See, that's why I like Deutsche Welle here, because we get views from all over, including India. Sir? Yeah.
Yes, I'm also interested in the connection between populism and extremism. And I mean, a few comments that you made struck me, because I think of Nigeria and I think of how the same tools that some people expect Muslims to deploy in the event of a terror attack are being employed against other Muslims. So for example, in Nigeria, we've had very popular state terrorism against Shiites. It's very popular. And there's a reason why it's easy, for example, in Nigeria to call for the death of Shiites in Nigeria. And nobody will call it hate speech, because we seem to be united in our hatred against Shiites. And apart from football and corruption, this unites us, that we all think, okay, well, it's okay for the government to kill 1,000 Shiites in 24 hours. This is something that's almost, we agree on this. And so it's the same thing, non-Shiites do the same takfir, or they are not Muslims, or they pray so and so way, or they're not, they're not like us. And so they're a nuisance in the society. And so we can turn away when the government kills them. And that is state terrorism against Muslims. And then you're talking about the issue of diversity. Then can we have Shiites and Sunnis living in this area, at the same time? And can we, at what point do we support this populist belief that it's fine to kill a certain, section of the population? Which also brings me to the point of, whether or not people condemn an act, as far as I'm concerned, is irrelevant. It wouldn't change a single thing if Muslims come out and say, oh, we are against terrorists and all of that. And it assumes a certain monolithism of Islam which doesn't exist. In fact, within Salafi groups, there are several types of Salafis. Don't even go. Even among so-called Wahhabi groups, there are several types of Wahhabis. Yeah. So even when people talk about Wahhabism, I always think, well, we're making such grave generalizations that Wahhabism is the cause of all of this. When in fact there are debates among Wahhabis about, for example, ways and means of achieving jihad, which is something that's people don't talk about. And so I think we shouldn't even talk about whether Muslims should come out and demonstrate. In the same way you wouldn't ask, all people of a certain color to come out and demonstrate when someone of their race does something. So we force monolithism upon Islam, and we apply it only to Islam, in fact, when we do not apply it to other religions and ethnic groups. And so I think that we start thinking of populism, I'm very worried about places where populism is accepted and it's positive, like in places like Nigeria, where it's accepted to kill a certain people because of what they are perceived to be.
We only have 5 minutes. I'm going to take that gentleman, and then I'd like to have another round table here.
Hi, my name is Khalid Al-Bay. I'm a political cartoonist from Sudan. I work online. I'm an independent political cartoonist. I work online on social media. I think before we get to this stage where we're talking about right now, we need to just discuss populism. Where did that come from? And I think a big part of it, as the gentleman said, is the media. Because I work on social media, everything now is about what's trending, right? So ISIS is trending, right? So as a cartoonist that lives on social media, I have to do something about ISIS. It doesn't matter where ISIS comes from. It doesn't matter what made ISIS exist. It doesn't matter. Nobody knows. People have no idea. You have to condemn ISIS. What is ISIS? What does it stand for? I don't know, but we have to condemn it, right? It's really that. I mean, that's absolutely the problem. We're running in, as media is running in this hamster wheel of takeaway news. We're just running. We need to, what's viral today? Who's the enemy today? It was Al-Qaeda. Now is ISIS. Tomorrow is, it's whatever is happening now. You know, before we had like Michael Jackson and Bubbles all over the news, right? Now this is really ISIS now. This is what's happening. Everybody's blaming diversity and how can we take, yeah, this is great, but where did this come from? This is what people need to know. Where did this come from? How did this start? Is it the Iraq war? What got the Iraq war here? Are we going to lie to ourselves and say this is not about money? It is about money. How did we get here? Is it because of the occupation? Is it because of what's happening in Palestine? Is it because of what how France was in Algeria for 300 years? Is it what happened in Algeria with 1 million people died? Is it what happened? People don't know these things. People want to know about now. What's trending now? What's going viral now? This is the problem. So this is great, but we really need to, media needs to focus on what's going on, the history of things, because nobody knows. Nobody has any idea. And I talk to people. I have, living online and just because of censorship, because of totalitarian regimes and censorship that is in fact supported by the West, who's trying to help the situation right now. All these leaders that all these people get away from are supported by these regimes. I'm from Sudan. Bashir, our president for 30 years, yeah, and he's wanted by the ICC in The Hague, now is being paid by the EU to stop the refugees from coming to Europe.
Absolutely.
Where do you think this money is coming from?
Yeah.
Where do you think this money is going? It's going to killing us.
Yeah.
This is where he's not only killing, he's not stopping in his head is killing. That's what that means, So this is what's going on. The EU needs to really understand where this comes from as a government, and EU people and the West as a whole, I'm sorry if I'm generalizing, needs to know where these enemies, how these enemies were created. Yeah. And these nightmares are created.
We all know Canada is selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. So.
And now, with the Trump deal and all of he's going back home and he said, I sold weapons to Saudi Arabia for $1 million, and everybody's clapping. He sold weapons.
Yeah.
And everybody's clapping. Isn't that incredible? I was like, yeah, he's bringing business.
It's same with Canada,
So this is what people need to know.
I'd just like to give everybody, all the speakers, 30 seconds to say a few closing comments before the end.
I don't have much to say. I think I learned more
from you
than anything I've done in the last year. But I think the gentleman colleague from Sudan, I'd like to see more journalists writing about Western states selling arms to these oppressive regimes. I think this is a scandal. There's been a lot of people in Canada outraged about us sending weapons to Saudi Arabia, doing really shady deals with countries. The civil society in the West does try to change these things, but there are deep economic interest, and how do we change that? But I think if you can expose some of that, it's really important to work transnationally and try to bring about change.
And 2 years ago, we were here, and Raif Badawi, who is still imprisoned in Saudi Arabia, was still there, and he's still there today. On Friday, I was there with the Mumcu Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, calling for his liberation. And look where we are today, selling arms to Saudi Arabia, and Raif Badawi is still in prison, and he won a prize here 2 years ago. So, Andre.
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity. I learned, like Kyle, I learned so much from all of you. And I think in the end, it's, again, being careful as societies that we do not fall into extremes. Our discourses in relation to all of this, how we deal with extremism so that we do not become illiberal. But what you said, that last comment, I think it's all about education. But people need the time. You see, you were talking about social media, how people, everybody's on a rut. We're running. We're always... give me that 30-second bite of news. It takes time to actually sit down and learn about this stuff, but we need to do it. And I think our survival as democracies depends on it, definitely. So
Laura?
thank you.
Yeah, also thank you very much that I was allowed to be here. And yeah, also to that, to this thing of we have to explain where it's all coming from. As I said, all these conflicts are there are like a million layers to these conflicts, and like the roots to these conflicts are so far back to most of the things we're seeing today. And the problem in media, as far as I see it, is like it all costs money to research it because like I need to have the time to do it. I need to survive on something while I'm researching this. Media has less and less money for research, for deep investigative research. And then there's like all these things like word counts and like the limited amount of time you have on TV, like put everything into 2 minutes, 3 minutes.
Yeah.
Like that's what I get. That's what I get. And then like explaining like such a complex conflict, it's getting really hard. And that's like the challenge. And I completely agree with you. And especially I agree on like
sorry to like, but it's when things reoccur, people don't want to hear it anymore because we're addicted to like new thing. What's the new thing? You know. So when an attack happens in one place twice, it doesn't matter if a drone comes and kills a whole family in a wedding in Afghanistan. Nobody wants to hear about it because it's Afghanistan. Yeah, it's okay. Or like Boko Haram in Nigeria or whatever. People don't want to know. This is the media's fault because we need to push this information that people don't want to know about. If it's more attractive to know about, yesterday I read this breaking news. A French woman was killed and 11 injured in where was it in South America?
Yeah.
So the first thing was a French woman killed, 11 injured. French woman killed 11. We don't care about the 11 injured. It's the French woman that killed. We need to investigate that
absolutely
ASAP right now. What's going on with the French people, right? So this is what we need to, this is what we need to figure out.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for being such an engaging audience. Thank you very much. And if you have more questions, I'm sure we can do it over coffee over there. And thank you so much for coming. Thank you to our speakers. And good work, everybody. Thank you.
So, 1, 2, hier.
Hello. Oh. So, welcome. And thank you for coming to our session, New Ways Forward, How Media Innovators Foster Social Cohesion and International Understanding. My name is Cornelia Reichel. I'm responsible for the international media programs at the Robert Bosch Stiftung. And in our team, we are running and funding multilateral programs for media professionals to foster cross-border cooperation and nuanced international reporting. Why this panel and what for? These days, we see that media actors worldwide face multiple challenges, a radically changing media landscape and media market, not to forget political pressure and other limitations to the freedom of press in many countries, and also growing polarization and disinformation that threaten social cohesion. But one can also observe how media innovators react to these challenges by developing new approaches. And we want to have a closer look today at one of these approaches, which is community engagement. And I'm very happy to discuss opportunities and challenges with our high-ranked journalists and engagement pioneers from different parts of the world. And since one of the premises of our foundation's work is that exchange and cooperation help to tackle global challenges and contribute to mutual international understanding, we think it will be even more interesting to exchange best practice, experience and perspectives, not only on our wonderful panel, but with all of you. So we will open our discussion right after a first round on the panel for your contributions, and then have 2 or 3 more rounds that will be alike. But now, first of all, welcome to our wonderful panelists, and I want to introduce these great people that combine a wide range of approaches and perspectives. So I'll start to my right with Thiranush Premchaiporn, which is the director of Prachathai from Bangkok in Thailand. She graduated in journalism at Thammasat University, Faculty of Journalism and Mass Communication, and has always been strongly involved with issues such as freedom of expression or the openness of internet. For her activities, she was awarded the Courage in Media Award, but she was also prosecuted and convicted for not having removed posts deemed insulting to royalty. Currently, she's the director of the Foundation for Community Educational Media, and one of its projects is Prachathai, an independent alternative online source of news, analysis, and opinion on issues that are important for the development of a democratic society. Then, Then Pavel Andreev, the co-founder and CEO of Siem 7x7 from Syktyvkar in Russia. Before founding Siem 7x7 in 2010, Pavel has been active for the International Human Rights and Historical Society Memorial, where he is now a board member. And 7x7 is a Russian regional independent online media outlet with a focus on human rights issues. It combines professional journalism and a blog platform that unites civil society actors for online discussions and offline activities. So now I take the turn from my left to make it more interesting. Sam Guma, the founder and executive director of Uganda Radio Network from Kampala, Uganda. Sam worked as a journalist, editor, researcher, and lecturer in communication at various media and academic institutions in Uganda before he founded the Uganda Radio Network. The network includes an independent, not-for-profit agency and a training program, that also works with engaged citizens. And Natalia Antilava, the co-founder and CEO of Coda Story from Tbilisi, Georgia. Natalia is an Emmy nominee and award-winning journalist who has been reporting from various regions of the world for the BBC, as well as for The Guardian, Forbes magazine, Washington Post, and The New Yorker. With Coda Story, she founded a web platform that puts a team of journalists on one crisis at a time, to cover it from many different angles and to stay with it also after the spotlight moves on. And Paul Steiger, the founding editor-in-chief and current executive chairman of Propublica from New York, USA. Before Paul founded Propublica in 2008, he had been the managing editor of the Wall Street Journal for more than 15 years. And with Propublica, he founded an independent non-profit newsroom that produces investigative journalism in the public interest. Propublica was awarded the Pulitzer Prize 4 times and the Emmy Awards twice, which of course also helps to maximize the impact of the work of Propublica. And to top our panel off, I would love to introduce my co-moderator, Erik Albrecht. Erik has been working as a freelance journalist for the German press agency dpa, the Deutsche Welle and Deutschlandradio, from Moscow, Sheffield and Berlin. He also works as a researcher and editor at DW Academy, where he's focusing on the post-Soviet region and on strategic questions of media development. For example, he's the co-author of last year's study, Advancing Freedom of Expression, that explores digital innovations to advance freedom of expression and access to information. At DW Academy, Erik is currently working with a team on a study for Robert Bosch Stiftung to better understand different approaches of media innovators and their role in civil society. So before we start with our discussion, maybe you can give us some small insights to your findings of the study already.
Yeah, maybe very briefly. So I talked to basically people like you and mostly like to you, most of you. And I'm very pleased to see you here now. And we have a little bit more time to discuss. We call them new media actors, media innovators, and we looked at those who work closely with civil society or have a connection, a special connection to civil society, to society. And all of them were saying basically, we're looking what mainstream media are doing, what traditional media, be it offline or online actually, electronic or print, are doing, and we're saying that mainstream media is not doing the job, it's not doing the job they are supposed to do. And most of you founded non-profit organizations. And what I found the most inspiring with it as a journalist is that you founded organizations that actually are going, like new media actors doing things differently, but it's basically a lot of you are trying to do good journalism in its old principle ways and returning to that. So it's often the analysis is much more for a lot of these organizations that journalism is failing as it is now, but journalism might have some new technologies right now, but it doesn't have to be reinvented completely. There's something we can go back to, a little bit like what this morning also Amanda Bennett said, that there are principles of journalism, we have to go back to them, to reporting, engaging with communities, etc. And all these organizations work in very different spheres, from investigative journalism, from there are other initiatives, projects, actors that try to make voices heard that are not heard currently in society. Some, like you, for example, are actively trying to push traditional media also in the sense that they can rely on your reporting and can draw from it, and maybe other organizations also get better. And of course, there's engaging and empowerment and engagement with community. And yeah, first of all, I'm very glad to meet you finally personally, and I'm looking forward to all these questions. And maybe we start the discussion with this question, yeah, how you engage in these things. Sam, you told me in the interview we had via Skype before that through you, local communities get news about their communities for the first time. How do you do this?
Thank you. I'm a broadcaster, so I'm less used to being interviewed than the other way around. So I really like to interview than this side. Just a little background about my country, not the history. For almost 150 years, we had media in which a person with a title was more important than the issue. So a story became important if it started with the president. In my country, if the news started just 25 years ago, if the news started a bulletin in any broadcast institution, and it didn't start with the president, and the second item, the vice president, and the third, the prime minister, then that meant there has been a coup d'etat. And we had 9 coup d'etats in quick succession. Fast forward to 20 years ago, we have media that is not owned by the state. And majority of the media institutions we have in my country right now are not owned by the state. Most of the media institutions started as part of this big liberalization policy. So they started as extensions of supermarkets, extensions of gas stations. And so they were all meant for entertainment and to make just a little income for their owners. About 15 years ago, everybody discovered that, hey, look, media can be influential. And so once again, we had media institutions not owned by the state, but doing exactly the same thing that state media had done for nearly 70 years. Starting the story with the president and the vice president and the prime minister. So what my institution has tried to do first and foremost is to say the issue is more important than the person. So we could have a news bulletin of 15 minutes and the story of the president is the last story, or there is no story that talks at all about the president. How to do that has been the basic reorientation of journalists. We do it in 2 ways. One way, for people who've been trained as journalists and have worked as journalists, it's been long, hard training and orientation to say, hey, look, if there's been an accident, and we have lots of those on our country's roads, and you have lots of people that are hurt, that is more important than the president simply saying what he has said for the last 15 years. And that's been very difficult, believe you me, but we're winning. The second way is been to basically use the new tools of information technology. Once again, my country was the first country in the world where the number of mobile phone lines overtook the number of landlines in the whole world. Now, we didn't clap for ourselves simply because we had very few landlines. So as soon as mobile phones came, we could get more mobile phones in less than a year than the landlines that existed in the country. Now that we have lots of mobile phones around, what we've basically been doing is to get the ordinary people who've been used to being talked down to for more than 70 years of broadcasting. They've been listening to people with titles, tell them something. Ask them, please say something about yourself, say something about your community. And therefore, the role of the journalist has now been listening to the community, listening to what they say, getting the journalism newsroom to know that, hey, look, it's not what the big people say, but if you really listen to the voices of the community, you get to understand what our country is all about. That basically is the short version of what we are doing.
But are those call-in broadcast radio programs, or do you go further than this?
It all started with call-ins because that was the easiest format available. But as you know, calling rates are very expensive. So we've now graduated from simple use of call-in programs to using new tools and apps. We've got lots of brilliant people all over the world that are able to design apps that make the possibility of recording yourself and sending that recorded voice over data into a broadcast institution, into a radio station, into a TV station at a cost cheaper than an ordinary text message. So we started off with call-ins, simple call-ins, because back then in the mid-90s when we started, that's what was available. But right now we are trying to exploit the tools of information technology that are available in form of applications, and we're getting more information from the communities simply because it's become cheaper with the new apps.
Paul, when I prepared for the interview with Propublica, I saw you were looking for a senior engagement officer, or not officer, editor actually. What does someone like that do at Propublica? Should be working? It should be working
Hello?
already.
Working? Thank you. The senior engagement editor has transformed the job as the job has changed for us. We have had 3, and early on, engagement and use of social media meant finding an audience for our stories. When we started in 2008, we didn't even know how to pronounce our name, and nobody else knew how to pronounce our name. And we would do an investigative story, expose wrongdoing by government or business or unions or anywhere there's power, and we wanted to get the story read. There were 2 ways to do it. One was to partner with other news organizations, which we did and still do with the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, with all of the television networks, with over 150 now different news organizations. The second thing that we did was to use social media, and that started with Twitter. We very quickly became huge on Twitter for a news organization. We would have been the 4th or 5th biggest newspaper in America. But this last time, when we were looking for a senior engagement editor, we were already thinking about let's transform the way we use engagement, because we now knew how to pronounce our name and other people knew how to pronounce our name. We were getting our stories picked up both with partnerships and without them. But how could we engage more with the community? How could we use these new mechanisms not just to promote our stories, but actually to write our stories? So, for example, we started using tweet storms. Raise your hand if you know what a tweet storm is. Okay, not very many. Quick example. Last November, after the election in the U.S., over Thanksgiving weekend, which is a big holiday in the U.S., President Trump announced that he actually had won the popular vote in the United States. Now, he'd won the electoral vote, and that's what counts, but he had lost the popular vote by 3 million votes. He said, if you took out the fraudulent votes, the 3 million plus fraudulent votes, he would have won the popular vote too. Well, we had a team that had followed the voting very, very closely. We put together a team of 1,000 journalists all around the country, monitoring polls, monitoring reports of interference with voting. If there had been anything like 3 million votes tampered with, we would have known about it. So it's a holiday weekend. How do you get the message out? Our new senior engagement editor said, let's do 13 or 14 tweets, one after another. You can do it faster than writing a traditional news story. You can speak in the straightforward vernacular of the way we talk to each other instead of the voice of God that news stories carry. And we have a very simple message. We can put it across that there was no fraudulent voting of any significance. The story went out. It had very significant impact. Lots of people picked it up, and it's a technique we've used again and again. Another way of using the engagement capability is finding people who can help us generate a story or can enhance a story. For example, right now we have a major effort going on maternal mortality and morbidity, which in the US is a scandal. We're the richest country in the world, but we have mothers dying in childbirth at a rate that puts us near the bottom of the industrialized world. And so we've done a couple of stories, major stories, about how women died when they just absolutely should not have. And but we wanted to broaden the base of this. So we said, tell us your story. We put out a message that said, tell us your story. If you nearly died, or if you have a relative who died or nearly died in childbirth. And it went out across the whole country, and we're getting access to people who have intimate stories, important stories to tell on this subject that are across the board, not just the people who voted against Donald Trump, but the people who voted for him. So we're broadening our base. So using social media to produce stories and using social media to engage with the community in ways that we haven't been able to before.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I mean, this was already a very wide range of what you can do to engage communities. And there was another different approach that Coda Story and Natalia tried. Like last year, you thought about traveling the Balkan route with a pop-up newsroom. And yeah, in the end, you focused on Germany, but you kept the idea of having a bubble in the town in Berlin, close to the Tempelhof Airport, where is the biggest camp, refugee camp in Berlin. And well, what would be interesting for me, because we were actually working together in this project as well, what did you want to achieve, and what were your lessons learned?
Sure. The I think I've always had a very grass is always greener, and I've always had a very romanticized notion of, probably very romanticized notion of doing local news, and always felt sad that I've never got to do any local reporting. I've always either reported for international outlets or did it in foreign countries. But I think because it is precisely because of kind of the community engagement that you get, that local reporting is so powerful and so meaningful, I think. But internet has changed that, and I think it's changed the very definition of local. So I think local becomes, in many cases, the interest area of things that you follow, things you're invested in for whatever reasons. So that was very much the notion of Coda Story when we first set up. And of course, you know, we have parallel kind of subject strands, editions that we follow. So we take a subject or a crisis and we put a team on it, and we really discover it from many ways. And obviously from the very beginning, we were thinking very hard of what do we do in terms of engagement. I'll get to the mistakes. One of the things, apart from, because, you know, we had just started, so we're very new. You know, we had no audience when we started out, and building the audience around these niche subjects was, you know, tricky, and we were trying to figure out how to do it. And one of our reporting projects was on refugees in Germany. We wanted to look at integration, not the journey, because we felt the journey had been done really, really well, but integration was not, or what happened after the post-journey story could have benefited from a lot more nuanced and a lot more rounded coverage. And it was with this story, was the coverage of the refugees in Germany, that we came up, not entirely on our own, with the concept of holding. It all started out as an idea of that halfway through the reporting, so we would put a team of journalists onto a story, and we would produce, you know, multimedia reports and videos and series and text pieces about the refugee experiences in Germany, but also about people, you know, people who both welcome them and don't, and what it means in terms of political implications. So it would be the range of stories. And then we would bring these journalists for something that we imagined would be a town hall meeting-like event, where we would get both the audience and the people from our stories, as well as the journalists, together to kind of look at the reporting and talk about the issues and so on. I mean, to be honest, the idea was, you know, you have all these great ideas, but once it comes to implementing them, there's also, you know, an issue of finding money for it. And I think that was probably the biggest mistake, probably was being hijacked by the fact that we couldn't quite find the money for what we wanted to do, but we did meet someone who wanted to do something kind of similar, but not quite similar. And the big idea was to basically have a, I mean, this sounds really crazy, but we have this mobile newsroom that would travel around Europe. It was this transparent giant bubble, like a real bubble-looking transparent tent. And then the idea of our partner was that they would travel around Europe and have journalists working out of this bubble. And we said, well, we can't do that because, you know, traveling in a bubble doesn't exactly send the right message. And also, like, who would want to work in a bubble? But why don't we, you know, use it to have a town hall meeting? And it was a way of, you know, that kind of, we thought we came up with like a solution that met halfway, and we would hold this meeting in Berlin, and we would get the refugees and get the journalists. It all went pear-shaped because the bubble could only be used in a certain time of year, because then it would be either too hot or too cold. So we were very limited in the time where we could do it. And it ended up, and because we couldn't get enough people to, we didn't have enough of the reporting done, it also started from the other way around, basically. First we wanted to do the reporting and then have the meeting, the kind of the physical, meet in the physical space, but it went the other way around. But our partner wanted to have the meeting first and then do the reporting. It didn't work because it ended up being a bunch of high school kids in the bubble, and there was no meaning to that conversation at all. I'm not sure they got anything out of it, frankly. But it was an interesting experiment, and I think above all it kind of taught us not to compromise on the, and also to avoid gimmicks.
But you have new projects, like in this direction, new ideas, something that
You know,
came up?
I do think that, I mean, because we're doing a lot of the international stuff, that idea of putting people together in the same space is a little harder to implement than if we were doing more local stuff. But I do think, but we are working very hard on trying to figure out how we engage audiences differently, and we certainly haven't given up on, you know, I mean, and it's not, we're not in reinventing the wheel. Plenty of journalism organizations do conferences and do events and do, you know, various things, and we're trying to figure out a way that sort of really plays to our strength, where because we are staying on a certain subject, we can bring people who are like really have experience of it together. So so yeah, it won't be in a bubble, but you know, something like that. You know, something like a meeting of that sort can happen, and then there are so many other ways, I think, to engage today. And I was just thinking today, and I kind of wonder what everyone else thinks about, you know, how sort of the up and coming political leaders. You know, from all sides of the spectrum, whether it's Jeremy Corbyn or Macron or Donald Trump. I mean, one thing they're so amazing at is audience engagement and kind of that direct communication with their audiences. And I think that's something that journalists somehow, politicians, it feels like politicians got there almost before us, because we're still keeping, you know, I don't know if there is possibly a way of more direct talking to the audiences.
Yeah, one way you have, Pavel, actually. So your media outlet does journalism, is also a place where human rights activists and other civil society people from civil society can have their blog posts and write opinion pieces, write their blogs. But you also do a thing called Barcamp, where you actively engage with your readers and with your audience. How does this work? What's the approach behind that?
Thanks, Eric, for the question, for the ability to speak there, and sorry for them, for those who see only my back.
Yeah, the idea was actually that everyone would sit all around. So.
You have a chance to see me in front in the last 15 minutes. Yes, so what we do. So the idea of our website was that to do not only media, but to do like a tool for the activists. Because 5 people who co-founded our website, nobody of them was a journalist. But we understood that the journalism they built climate and the environmental for the civil activists. Situation in Russia a little bit better in Uganda. But we are, for the last 15 years, on the right way. And I mean that...
the president first,
yes,
then no vice president, but the prime minister.
Yes. And we want a little bit change this situation. And what we did, we decided to focus on their... because Russia is very super centralized country. When everything happens in Moscow, and people think that outside of the Moscow nothing happens. So that's why we decided to focus on the small regions, to show people that civil society exists also in the regions where people think that nothing happens. This was part of our first part of our strategy. The second one was think that now in Russia the word hybrid is very popular. So everybody speaks about hybrid wars and the hybrid regimes. So to describe ourselves and to be in mainstream, we also use the word hybrid. Yes, because we.
But not with wars together.
Huh?
Not with wars together.
Not what?
No war.
Hybrid. No war. Yes. We're a hybrid website. What does it mean? We do think that in our days, good regional website should be a result. Should be a common result of work of journalism and the civil activists, and that's why we established in every region where we start to work, we established a cooperation with the local NGOs, and with the what we think that we can empower NGOs to be to have a higher voice. To involve new people to their activities, but also they help us to be on the ground, to speak about real problems. And the third part of the strategy, we think that in our days it's very important to have a synergy between online media and the offline actions. And because if you don't use online, your offline trainings, your offline meetings, they don't involve enough people for social change. But also, if you do only online media, you don't have enough impact in real life. That's why, for the reason of this, we decided together with the civic activists in regions to understand on what topics we can do these offline actions together. Our journalists do news, then we analyze it. Then, so we also analyze lots of blog posts, lots of social nets, and finally we decide on what topics are the most important to do something in region offline. And we do these different events in a year. And the most popular is Syktyvkar Barcamp, as you mentioned, is the informal conference which happens in the forests and in our small city. More than 400 people took part in it. Then we do the same experience in the second region in Kirov, and also we do lots of other types of activities. We do trainings, we do blog tours where people from different NGOs and the bloggers go together to cover some problems. So in this uniting people from internet to the offline NGOs, we think it's our mission. I think only this hybrid style of work can work in our small regions.
So your journalism is profiting from your rootedness in civil society and the other way around, yeah? Like the activist world shapes your journalism to some extent, but also journalism makes the activist or NGO scene stronger in the end then.
Yes.
Maybe, yeah, Shiranuj. You have a very difficult task as well. Working with groups that might face discrimination like LGBTQ, but also prisoners. And personally, I think that it might be very hard to engage with them beyond the standard interview. Do you have like approaches to do this, to handle this?
Actually, we didn't plan at the beginning to cover on the prisoner, but because of the political situation in Thailand, like the scene is already like the political in conflicts for 10 years. Numbers of the political prisoner, which is I think in Thailand we're not used to that kinds of like the people. We familiar with the political prisoner from Myanmar, not in Thailand. But from last 10 years, I think numbers of the political prisoner increased. And one of the issue is related to the core value about the freedom of expression, because when we talk about the media in Thailand, they can cover, they have kind of like the more freedom. The issue that media in general cover is quite like a variety and diverse, except one topic that is like a taboo, talk about the royal family or the monarchy. And my organization, we cover on that, related to, this is related to the public matters, the public interest. And when there are numbers of the political prisoners related to the restriction on free speech. Our journalists just follow that story. They just want to follow the story about the free speech, the restriction on free speech. But from time to time, more and more have to be contact with the political prisoner. It's a tough job. I have to say this is a tough job for my colleagues. They have to do the prison visit often. Every time got just only 15 minutes how to build the trust sometimes with the people who are, they don't know our journalists before, how to build the trust and how to embrace how the difficulties of the life of the person who are in prison at that time and also the family. I think building trust is the most important part of how our journalists can can follow the story and can publish the kinds of story. But it's hard for our team because I think the trauma when we have to learn about the difficulties of the life, the suffering of the family. And as a journalist, we try to be the impartial or objectivity, but it's hard when we learn about the suffering of the people, and it's also part of the democratic development that is in the bad shape. Yeah.
So you would say that actually your kind of engagement is building up trust, having a long-term relationship, or do you also get stories, or do you have other forms, approaches of engagement?
It's when particular on the issue of the prisoner, I think the building trust is very crucial. But after we publish the story, we continue to publish the story on the freedom of expression, the political prisoner who've been charged with the lèse majesté or the royal defamation. People already know about it, and sometimes we known about the case by the people just inform us, or the family inform us that there are someone got arrested because of the violence of the royal defamation. So this is a kind of the building and create. I think our media outlet, our publisher already been the prominent one to cover on the issue of the lèse majesté in Thailand.
Yeah, let's just open up. So we've seen a lot of broad range of different approaches to engagement. Is there anything from you to contribute, to ask, to comment? Yeah, you have the microphone, yeah.
Yeah, my name is Julius from the DW Academy. My question goes to Pavel. Normally, it's usual don't have an own political agenda as a journalist, and how is it to work together with activists and NGO, not to have your own agenda, or following their agenda? Isn't that a problem?
It's very popular topic for discussion in the team. So for example, can journalists be human rights defenders, for example, and how can activists can influence on the editor policy? So what we decide. I think it will be very hard for example, newspaper to deal with this question. But for the website, I think it's much more easy because we are not limited with the numbers of articles on the website, and we just spread our website onto blogs, something like this. So we have materials were made by the professional journalists. And they are with all the rules for the professional journalism. And also we have a big part of our website devoted to blog posts. And guys, if you want to cover some problems, if you want to write only about your activities without second point of view, for example, for some environmental organization, you can write there.
Is that like the Huffington Post model?
Huh?
Like the Huffington Post model?
Plus moderation, you think?
No, what Huffington Post is doing to give space for other writers and authors.
I'm not deeply understand how Huffington Post works, so that's why I cannot comment it.
I think the difference is that they do much more journalism actually, where Huffington Post really started from this opinion pieces only, and they from the beginning had both approaches actually. Any further questions? Yeah. This is difficult.
Thank you. I have a question to Sam. Sam, it was impressive, your description, but I was wondering what difference did it make, your change in journalism, especially on the local reporting? What changes did you see in these past 10 years when you changed the reporting to issues instead of persons or personalities?
Connie, do you want to?
Maybe I can say change is coming. There is no instantaneous change that I can describe, but over a period of 10 years, we've seen changes in attitude, we've seen changes at legislation level, and we've also seen changes at media professional and credibility level. Attitude, now we have everyone who has an issue knowing that it's important and they can be heard. So it's no longer a journalist driving or walking into a crowd or in a remote corner of the country and people looking for the nearest government official. It doesn't work like that anymore. Anytime you pull out a microphone anywhere, you got members of the community ready to say something, because now people begin to believe that they matter. It's not only the person with either an elected or an appointed title that matters. That is still coming. Of course, there are other levels that we're working on. Having succeeded at the primary level, we're now trying to take it further to levels such as gender, because we've had more men become more confident and express themselves more compared to women, and yet our society is more women than men. We're also trying to work at levels of youth versus the elderly to try and get all these changes permeate through to the different sectors of the community. At legislation level, we see government and other people with power come down very heavy and say, now you're putting voices of people who don't know what they're saying. And so we see legislation and proposed legislation to try and reduce the number of voices or legislate who can speak. So we are seeing legislation such as redefining who a journalist should be using academic credentials. So you do not have a qualification in journalism, you shouldn't be in public media. And that is a discussion that started. We somehow lost a bit of that in the legislation in the mid-90s, but we are regaining that. In the mid-90s, a law was passed that defined a journalist based on qualification. And the committee was set up and the professional body was set up. But the professional body that was set up with the law has collapsed in Uganda, so we're back to square one. But there is new effort to reintroduce it. But we are a little bit more active now, so we're able to challenge it at that level. And when it comes to the level of credibility and the strength of media institutions, we are seeing the media institutions that are able and willing to engage with the communities, that are having more voices of the community, get better audiences, and some of them translating that credibility into financial success. That, I would say, is in a nutshell what I can say so far.
Yeah, since you were talking about this question of how to reach other demographics, you were talking about gender and this. I imagine, Natalia, with you and your reporting on LGBT, on disinformation in Eastern Europe, you have a very different divide to bridge there to some extent, if you want to bridge it, about of a very divided society, or at least the discourse is very divided in people who are Putin's side of the LGBT discussion or on disinformation and hybrid warfare, as Pavel said before, and on the other side, where you probably are more on, how can you reach the other side in this discussion?
Listening to Samuel, I'm slightly jealous because definitely in much of the rest of the world, I think the trust as media is not then the up, it's the opposite. And I think definitely in countries that are directly affected by Russia, there's a real sense that journalists have been massive targets of smear campaigns by the government, and there is a real sense of kind of indifference of, you know, that I think the Kremlin's message of, you know, everybody lies has been extremely effective at eroding trust on so many levels. You know, one of the Coda's topics is indeed disinformation, and we were trying really hard. It wasn't even so much it wasn't so much focused on trust, but it was, although, you know, I mean, if you talk about meaningful community engagement, it's definitely, you know, that has to be part of it, right? You can only have meaningful community engagement if there is trust, both towards the journalists and the publications. But we were trying really hard to kind of explore the topic of that polarization in the society, the two different opinions, in a way, in a meaningful way. And one thing that we did, which was really interesting, we basically came up with, for our disinformation series, we came up with a video series that we call The Clash of Narratives, and it's a very simple premise. We basically follow two characters from the two opposite sides of the narrative. We've done a pilot. We're about to start 5 new seasons. Each has several episodes, and the fundamental to it, and so it's all video, and the fundamental kind of making it work is the very, very intimate storytelling, where it's, you know, this doesn't necessarily work in a 800 or even a 2,000 word piece where you look at one side and you look at the other side. In fact, that's part of the journalism. That's why journalism has become so polarizing, because so much of journalism is he said, she said these days, especially in broadcasting. But what we try to do with Clash is just to really get under the skin and into the lives of these two characters from two sides of the narrative. And we've done, you know, we've done our pilot on as 2 women. They're both in their early 40s, both incredibly articulate, very both sort of politicians / journalists in Georgia, you know, where in that part of the world, much of that part of the world, you know, you don't have the luxury to be just one or the other. But one is very, very pro-Russian, and one is very pro-Western, kind of fiercely pro-Western. And we follow them through both the election in Georgia, but also looking at how they're reacting to the election in the United States and how that affects the region. And the really interesting, what we learned from doing it, and why we think it's worth continuing to do it, is that, you know, while I don't think anyone changed their mind, the surprising thing to me was that both of these characters, I thought it would be a good outcome if they both hated it, but they both loved it, which I found really, really surprising. But what also happened was, I don't think anyone changed their minds. I think people who, you know, liked the pro-Russian politician still liked her afterwards, and the opposite was true. But I think what it did, I think it forced both sides to watch the other in a more kind of, in a deeper, more meaningful way than the sound bites. And I think, you know, it kind of, in a little way, it kind of bridged that, the gap that is in so many ways getting wider and wider.
Well, but I think this is like the perfect example of how dialogue works, and that it actually does matter.
Yeah, although they were actually never in a dialogue together, because we would not be able to get them in the same room. So it was a very kind of tricky balancing act of making sure that you were fair to both.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we would actually have loved to have like a bigger around about how to reach the other side, and maybe we can still ask Paul and Cyrano, because I would like for just to end the discussion about how we can reach the other side. Cyrano, you're doing advocacy for like political prisoners and other marginalized groups. What would you say? I mean, do you have any possibility to reach beyond the people that think as you do, that think that this is important?
If you know Thailand, you will know like the majority of Thai public very royalty, really like love the our previous king is like the beloved king. So basically, if the people who was accused or prosecuted with the insult to the king, it can be the person that been hated by most of the country and can be discriminated a lot. That also, I think, for us, it's very important to deliver the message, try to publish the story, to reach out the public as much as possible, to understand that these political prisoner or these convict are not demon, are not devil. They are just like the human being. They are just someone who probably they want to express some feeling, some love or not love, and the way that we try to do, and I think is a little bit success, is about try to bring the size of the humanity into the public, to understand this is just like the ordinary people that have like the beautiful mind, even they are being locked up in the prisons as a kind like the enemy of the state or enemies of the people. So I think this is a way that we just try to bring in the human being to for the people who maybe have some attitude, negative attitude toward these people, to understand or accept more. I think this is one thing.
Paul, on your website it says, and I'm not here to question this at all, that Propublica does non-partisan journalism, yet the White House spokesman has once called you a left-wing blog. How far can you get with this journalism to reach the other half of the other side of the American debate, which looks right now, at least from here, being very polarized and very divided? How can you still reach those people that believe in this theory, that you are very, very biased?
Well, that was one of the best things that happened to us when Sean Spicer accused us of being a left-wing blog, because we were able to do a tweet storm in the next 20 minutes that resulted in us getting a gusher of letters of support and, more importantly, money from small, ordinary people, $25, $50, $100, because we're able to show that we're not just attacking business and government and wealthy people when they do bad stuff, and we're not just dealing in that range. For example, one of our major exposés was about companies that hook poor people, low-income workers. In some cases, they were actually soldiers and their families at military bases. In other cases, just simply low-income workers. And the idea was to promise them credit when they couldn't get credit elsewhere. And of course, the interest rates were 50, 60, 80, 100% a year. And people quickly couldn't pay, and they found courts to take the money out of their bank accounts, take their houses if they had one, take their car if they had one, and no one is in favor of people being ripped off like that. Another example was nurses. We all love nurses, right? They give us care, but bad nurses beat up patients, steal their drugs. And we found that in California, the board that licenses nurses was taking as long as 6 years to take the license away from a nurse who had stolen drugs from a bunch of patients, and the patients were permanently disabled, and in a couple of cases died. When we published the story, the governor of the state was a right-wing Republican, and he fired the board and replaced them with people who were supposed to fix the problem. Not even the union, you know, the Union of Nurses is one of the most left-wing sources of power in the U.S. Not even the union, the nurses union, would oppose what we did.
So it's convincing through journalism, basically.
It's convincing through journalism. There are other ways to reach out, as I described before, trying to invite anyone, including people from red states, blue states, purple states, whatever, to give us their stories about mothers who died in childbirth or nearly died in childbirth. We don't care what part of the country you're from. That's an important story to us.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, I think that we heard like wonderful best practice examples. We heard how it is possible to reach the other side of our communities, of our society. We talked about challenges, but a lot about opportunities as well. And I think when we look into the future, there is a lot of hope. There is a lot to do, and yeah, I think that we should just go on, share our experience, and also work together, because all these methods that are here on our panel, that are like all the experiences here on our panel that is here in the room, that will help us to really engage communities to thrive and to lead to social cohesion. And well, with this, I would like to close this discussion, and I think that we have like the discussion with the room outside with a coffee, or yeah. And I will thank you very much.
Thank you very much
for being here with us, and thank you for coming.
Just in case, if something happens, let's agree. Take that. It's such practical things. After our event with John, we felt we should just have gone through in the beginning which door to take, how to escape quickly, where to go. December at the University of Zurich, in a large setting with 400 people. So. No.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session on freedom of press in Turkey. Today we have two guests, Mr. Özgür Mumcu, journalist at Cumhuriyet newspaper, and Mr. Ole von Özgür, the executive director of the Right Livelihood Award Foundation. First, I would like to ask you, Ole, could you tell us about the award a little bit, which is also known as the Alternative Nobel Prize?
The Right Livelihood Award is an award that we present in Stockholm, Sweden. That is where we are registered as a foundation. We've been presenting normally 4 awards a year since 1980. And the idea is to honor people or organizations who, in a practical and exemplary way, show solutions that go to the root causes of global problems.
And can you also tell us about the process with Cumhuriyet? I also believe you go on the ground to, check out what's happening and how these organizations are performing. Can you tell us the story behind the award and Cumhuriyet?
Indeed, we do. So everybody in the world can send us proposals for candidates. We don't have, like the Nobel Prizes, for instance, a rule where just the elites can send in nominations. And on the other hand, that means that all the due diligence, as you say, visiting candidates on the ground is work that my colleagues and me have to do ourselves. And in the case of Cumhuriyet, we were in Istanbul twice. Talk to your colleagues on the ground, talk to many of the ones who are today in prison and who then could not attend our award ceremony in December last year because in November 10 of your colleagues were imprisoned.
Exactly, and after Cumhuriyet newspaper received the award, you wrote in your column about this award, and you also said it was also a sad feeling. That's what you mentioned. Why was that?
Well, for quite obvious reasons, because I went to attend to the award ceremony because the others weren't able to do so. I mean, I wasn't in the first line to represent the newspaper, but all those who were supposed to represent the newspaper, they were either in prison or they had a travel ban. So I came there because the people were in prison. So it wasn't a very joyful moment for me, but of course it's I was quite proud because Cumhuriyet was first nominated, then shared the award with the other candidates.
And I believe it was in the same article where you talked about how the citizens themselves should be actually fighting for democracy. But in such an environment as Turkey is in right now, what can they do? How can they fight this pressure?
Well, yes, it's Well, I still believe that it's a civic duty to do whatever people can do for democracy and for the freedom of expression. And I know it can be quite tricky in places like Turkey, and we can see it with concrete examples, people are putting into jail. And not only that, people are losing their jobs, and they are exposed from public functions, etc., etc. So it's quite difficult in a place like Turkey. But I think we still have to keep on fighting on that, because it is becoming a question of survival, because I don't believe that we can go on like this in Turkey. So either people who are put into prison because of the reasons of freedom of expression, they're going to go out, or we are going to join them in the prison if it goes on like that. So I think we have to keep on fighting against this wave of repression, because it's not going to end if we do not do anything about it.
If I may,
yes, please.
on that, when our jury evaluates the candidates for the award, it's not in the first consideration is not what kind of political statement do we want to make, but the first consideration is really the quality of the work of a candidate. So I can say under this extremely difficult environment that you guys are working in, what convinced our jury was also that they're still doing such an amazing job, that they're keeping up the quality of their investigative journalism. So, I mean, Cumhuriyet is a prime example of how you can keep up courageous civic resistance or action even in a very difficult environment. And we had other journalists on our list. We had more than 100 nominations from all around the world. And Cumhuriyet was one of the 4 that convinced our jury because of the quality of this work.
And I recall some time back that outside of the paper, there were people coming and protesting every day, showing support. There were also little concerts given by very famous Turkish stars. How is that support? Do you still have a similar support, or has it diminished over time?
Well, of course, with time it has diminished a little bit, because it has been going on quite some time. And, our colleagues are in prison now more than 230 days, more or less 230 days. So we cannot keep on having demonstrations outside the newspaper during almost a year. Of course, it has diminished a little bit. I mean, we are not having any public events anymore. But I know that our readers are still with us. They are still buying the newspaper, and they're on the social media, etc. We can always see their support. And I think people are waiting for the first hearing at the courthouse to see the reaction of the Turkish judiciary. And we still hope that they're going to be released this July.
Yes, so before we go on in detail to that, we have a little video about family members of journalists that are in prison. If we could please watch that, if our technician could show it to us. There we go.
13 journalists working for Turkey's Cumhuriyet newspaper have been imprisoned for almost 8 months. Their wives didn't know each other before they all visited their husbands at the Silivri prison. This is the 32nd journey. Charlie Han Öz, Semra Çelik and Sinem User Kara now meet each Wednesday to see and talk to their husbands for 1 hour, who share the same destiny behind a dark and dirty window. The travel to Silivri prison will take hours, but they are ready for it.
During the 7 days between one prison visit to the other, I try to keep in mind everything about our life, our home, the school issues of our daughter, bank affairs, anything small at home, or the greetings for him. I developed a system for that. I write everything in that special notebook. I study it along the way because I have to memorize it all. We can't take any notes inside.
The bags on the seats are for their husbands. Taking clothes inside is a problem.
There's a list of how many items every prisoner is allowed to have at most. We are only to take listed objects with us, like 4 trousers, 3 shirts. We take them. 1 week we bring clothes, and the other week they give us the dirty ones to be washed.
And there is also a book problem. For 5 months they had to deal with the book ban, and with the help of the members of parliament and multiple letters, now
we can bring 2, 3, or 5 books, but they are allowed to keep just 10 books with them. When we bring new books, They give those books to the deposit or to the library. But now we can bring them books.
They are always worried about their husbands, who stay in cells made for 3 people.
They don't have the luxury to cook. My husband, for instance, has a gluten allergy, and I can't help him with this problem.
The blocks of Silivri are seen far away. They will soon enter the prison. They take out all the metal objects they are wearing not to lose any time at the security control. Silivri is one of the prisons in Turkey that has the highest security precautions. The visitors are checked several times before entering. It is even possible that they aren't allowed to enter that week if an object is found on them that sets off the alarm at checkpoint. The return is more difficult. Silence in the bus tells it all. Sinem and Charlie Han don't want to talk. They are tired. Semra summarizes what's on their minds.
The fact that we have to leave our husbands behind when the prison gates are shut, that is a very heavy burden.
After each prison visit, they feel hurt, but they never accept being the victim. Over the 7 months, they have turned their anger over their husband's imprisonment into patience. They now live not just for themselves, but also for their husbands. Life, in a way, has stopped for them, and they keep all their plans for the day their husbands will be set free.
So if we go back to life at Cumhuriyet, we've seen just a little piece of the lives of these women. How is the life at the newspaper, working under this constant pressure?
As you have seen, it's a newspaper which organizes regular bus trips to a prison on a weekly basis. So that also can tell us the atmosphere in the newspaper. But Cumhuriyet will still resisting and is trying to give news and make news according to its own principles, and nothing has changed in that perspective. And we're still trying to report under these circumstances, and our aim is to have the release of our friends or our colleagues as soon as possible, and without compromising our ideals at all. So Cumhuriyet is not bargaining with the government or trying to tone down its voice so that our colleagues are going to be released, because we think that that would be also a betrayal to our principles and to our friends in the prison.
And you just mentioned the trial that's coming up July 24th. After almost 8 months, there's going to be a trial. What do you think about the indictment concerning this trial?
Well, unfortunately, I happen to be a lawyer at the same time, and those are the two jobs that you shouldn't be doing in Turkey nowadays, because you can lose your hope in those professions. And working for a newspaper or being a lawyer, you really have very nihilistic feelings when you're trying to exercise those two professions. Well, first of all, they have waited 6 months for this indictment, which was quite some time, and that's why we were expecting something, at least something in the indictment. And after the release of the indictment, they have given 3 months for the first hearing. And all of those things show that the aim is not, the target of the judiciary is not to have a fair trial, but to punish them with the detention, with the arrests. I've read the indictment, and I haven't seen, even in the pro-government press, anything after the release of the indictment, anything which accuses the newspaper, because after the release of the indictment, everybody has seen that there is nothing substantial in it. So even those who are the fervent opponents of Cumhuriyet newspapers, they have stopped talking about the affair because there's nothing to talk about. I mean, there are very ridiculous allegations. Probably most of you don't know about it, but there's this a phone application called Bylock, which is supposed to, which was used by the Gülenist people, and they were the only ones who had it, of course, because you needed a special code in order to use that chat program. So there weren't any Bylock application in any of our colleagues. But some people who had the BILOG applications called them. That's one of the reasons, allegations in the indictment. So people who happen to have BILOG applications called those people or send text messages to those people, to our friends, to our colleagues. Even if you do not just reply back those people who are calling you or sending you text messages, it's not important for the prosecutor. They are saying that you had in some kind of a way you're related to that movement. Or there was another example which I found quite funny. The president of the foundation of Cumhuriyet, he has changed the tiles of his home. But everybody can do that. So he paid to the guy who changed the tiles of his house. So the son of this person who has changed his tiles did a business contract with an enterprise which is supposed to have some links with Gülenist movement. And this is also one of the allegations in this indictment. Then there's another one. One of our colleagues sent something around 70 euros to another colleague who was working in a pro-Kurdish TV channel. And that TV channel was later on closed down by the government under emergency rules. So they said, well, you have sent 70 or 60 euros to your friend who was working in a pro-Kurdish TV channel which was closed down by the government. So almost all the allegations are on that line. So, I mean, I'm quite sorry for the prosecutors who have written down or who were obligated to write down such an indictment, because, I mean, we're going to make fun of them later on in the future when these days will go over. But it's a shame for the profession, for journalism, or also for being a lawyer. It's quite a shame.
And the European Court of Human Rights recently also took a decision that was pro-Cumhuriyet newspaper, and they wanted the Turkish government to send a written explanation why these journalists are actually being held in prison. So do you expect them to be released at least on the 24th? Is it too optimistic to think that?
Well, as I have tried to underline, the rule of law doesn't exist in Turkey anymore. So we are not talking in the terms of law. We are talking about the political atmosphere. And if the political conjuncture or the atmosphere changes, they are going to be released. And the fact that the European Court of Human Rights accepted to see the case, to hear the case, might have an effect on the prosecutors. And I am personally expecting at least that they're going to release at least some of our friends from the prison. But as I've said before, everything depends on the political atmosphere right now.
And will you be following the Cumhuriyet trial?
Yes, we've been trying to do what we could from our position in order to help with the situation of the imprisoned colleagues. We have offices in Geneva also, where we're close to the United Nations human rights system, so we've been filing complaints through the United Nations human rights system. At least Turkey is answering. We got a 20-page reply with the same kind of arguments that you are quoting from the indictment, which in some remote way tries to link the people who are imprisoned with sources who in some way are connected with Gülen or other alleged terrorists. So even that is legally quite weak. And then we've replied again. And now the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, for instance, is looking at that. And the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression has come out very strongly after having met 5 of the imprisoned journalists and was at the Human Rights Council in Geneva just last week and again demanded their release. So there is something happening at the international stage, but we don't know how the Turkish state is going to react. And certainly, as for many of our laureates who are in danger for the work that they do, we follow the events very closely, and we also consider when it makes sense to be there in person.
And in one of your articles, you also talked about putting people in prison and accusing them of having some connection to the Gülenists, that the people that have nothing to do with them, kind of enforces Gülenist image. So how does it enforce them? How does it help them?
Well, because, I mean, if I really thought, well, even when the government, I mean, the AKP was in some kind of a semi-official coalition with the Gülenists, Cumhuriyet was reporting against the infiltration of this sect to the state apparatus. One of our colleagues who is in now prison, he has written a book about the infiltration of the Gülenist movement into the police organization, and he was put into jail by the Gülenists at that time. And now he is back in prison. Now this time he is supposed to be a Gülenist. So if you're doing this, you're ridiculizing the whole situation. And even when you're going after some, some people, some very low-level people who has got only sympathy for Fethullah Gülen. If you're putting them also in prison, you are also undermining all your fight against that infiltration in the state apparatus. Because what happened in Turkey during that coup, it was something really very serious. And Turkey has lost the control of its very important state institutions, and I know it sounds like a very bad B-movie, but it's really happened in Turkey. I mean, some religious secret organization infiltrated into the police and the police force, into the military, into the judiciary, and other parts of the state apparatus during 30 years. It was something quite important and very serious, and we have seen the outcome of it last year during the summer at the coup attempt. But the fight against it, if you want to really fight against it, you shouldn't be fighting against Cumhuriyet or some low-level people who just got some sympathy for that Fethullah Gülen person. If you're doing this, the image that you're showing to the whole world is that Fethullah Gülen, he was an innocent guy, and you're just using this as a tool to accumulate power in your hands. So I think, and it's not a decent way, and it's not a fruitful way of conducting a fight against a very dangerous organization.
Mm-hmm. And we're talking about actually fighting the Gülenist constructions inside of the Turkish state. And this is really interesting because just a few weeks ago, the Turkish government said they want to annul Gülen's Turkish citizenship. But before that, they were trying to extradite him from the US. So what does this maneuver mean?
Well, technically speaking, you can have the extradition of someone who doesn't have your nationality also. It is also a possibility, technically speaking. But in order to achieve the extradition of someone, you need some tangible proofs. And for that, you need fair trial and rule of law. So if you're undermining the rule of law and the principle of fair trial in Turkey, you are losing all your chances of having the extradition of those people. So when we are emphasizing the importance of rule of law, it is not because we are just, some freedom-loving and freedom-seeking hippies. That's because I personally believe that a strong state needs rule of law, because if you are undermining the rule of law, that's what we have. What we have is a chaos and a country which is not sustainable, and a country which cannot have the extradition of the people that they want to try at home, because nobody believes that in Turkey you can have fair trial. And Turkish government is adding to that image with all that it is doing.
And so we are talking about, of course, the freedom of speech in Turkey and freedom of press and how it's under pressure. When we look around the world, with your viewpoint, where does Turkey stand?
Regarding the freedom of press, there's a ranking by Reporters Without Borders, and they quantify it exactly. So their exact answer would be 151st rank of 180 countries ranked for their performance on freedom of the press. What we see when we look around the world is always the positive examples. I mean, we are optimists by training and by heart in the way we operate the Right Livelihood Awards. We get to see the best examples of organizations working in very, very difficult circumstances. But then we also, as I mentioned, we stick with the ones who received this award and we continue supporting them. Even laureates from the 80s, we still have contact. And of course, there's especially a reason to support when these people or organizations are threatened at home. And that, unfortunately, is something that we see spreading, both when it comes to freedom of the press, but also more generally when it comes to democratic space, that more than 100 countries around the world now have legislation that in some way makes it more difficult for civil society to operate. We see that people imprisoned is like the tip of the iceberg, but there are other very effective means now employed by authoritarian governments to freeze assets, to ban people from traveling. We had another laureate from Egypt, for instance, who just could not come to Stockholm in December. So governments have realized that this international solidarity and exchange is something very powerful, and they are very actively trying to block, blocking people from attending conferences like this, blocking organizations from receiving funding out of solidarity from often Western countries. So I think, authoritarian governments have realized that the media and civil society are very powerful forces, and they're taking very active steps in blocking that.
If we go back to Turkey, if we go to the CHP, the opposition party, last year they helped pass a bill which led to the lifting of the immunity of the lawmakers. And a couple of days ago, a CHP parliamentarian was arrested. But before that, after having passed this bill, there were more than 10 pro-Kurdish HDP parliamentarians were arrested. So now this discussion from last year is again being discussed, and CHP is being criticized. What do you think about this criticism?
Well, I think, most of the leaders of the CHP, they're not declaring it openly, most of them, but some, they do it. They regret their decision, I think. But it was quite obvious. The regimes like that, they just don't stop in one step. If they have the ability to go to the second or third steps, they will go to there. But I don't think there is a reason to criticize the CHP right now, because it will change nothing. What is important is that its president started to walk on foot from Ankara to Istanbul with a banner called, on which it's written justice. And now they are also seeking justice for all the HDP parliament members who are in prison. So what's done is done, but now they're also walking for them. So I think those who are in favor of democracy in Turkey, they have to back all those protests and bury the axis and talk about it later on if we have a real functioning democracy one day. But it's not the issue of today, I think.
What do you believe this walk is going to achieve? This walk for justice? There is some support right now, but Erdogan already criticized it just 2 days after the walk started.
Well, it's very difficult to foresee now, because the walk is supposed to go on for 28 days. We are at the day 5. It also depends how much support the walk is going to have. But it's maybe important for people abroad to see also that Turkey is not only Erdogan. The CHP has 1/4 of the total votes, so 25% of the population is voting that party, and its leader is now walking. And that is also quite important. In the referendum, we have seen that the Turkish society is divided into two. And if Erdogan doesn't really have the support of 70 or 60% of the population. So we got the other half of Turkey, even maybe more than the other half of Turkey, if we can convince those people who are voting for AKP. And they are not the property of AKP or Erdogan. But Erdogan wants to emphasize, like all the populist and authoritarian leaders, that only those who are voting for him constitutes the Turkish nation, and the others are just, some traitors or those who are not, who are a bit foreign to the national identity. But it's not the case. So I think that walk is one of the first steps to saying that we also belong to this nation. And not only those who vote for you is the Turkish nation. I think it's quite important in that matter, but we'll see the outcome, of course.
Mm-hmm. So before I open for the questions for the floor, I would like to ask you, Ole, one final question. We talked about all these oppositional voices that are struggling to survive. In your perspective, what would be a successful opposition voice around the world? What would you say is a successful oppositional voice that has, helped finish this maybe struggle or kind of survived the struggle?
I think the answer is very much connected with the topic here of diversity. I remember that one of our laureates, Manfred Max Neef from Chile, he always told the story of the swarm of mosquitoes that can really make the rhino angry. And I think what we see with our perspective, there isn't only the one alternative movement in the world, but there are so many movements, smaller, larger, even entrepreneurs, citizens getting together who are working for very concrete change in their home constituencies. And then with today's globalized communications, obviously it's much easier now for us in one place to learn from another place. So for instance, we gave an award to the development and entrepreneur who was developing solar power in Bangladesh. And now people in Africa are learning from that experience. And there's such a power in sharing and spreading practical developments. And that is where I really have hope, where you combine, people being affected locally, but at the same time being able to spread these solutions globally.
Thank you very much. Right, if you have any questions, the lady back there with the red dress.
Hello, thanks very much for your talk. It was very coherent and interesting to hear from you. So, a lot of people blame the Erdogan government for what's going on without really taking into consideration that the opposition basically for the last 13 years has been ineffective. And one of the reasons for it is it's not just the opposition party, but a tendency in Turkey for the institutions and the different parties to believe I'm doing the right job, I'm always going to stay here. Whereas in other societies, for example in the UK, you see the heads of the opposition, if they fail to return a successful outcome at elections, they step down. And we don't see this happening in Turkey at all. So my question is kind of, without this kind of farm team or fostering of new political leaders coming through on the opposition side, and also when we have a look at the government side, that it's basically one strongman party rule, do you think that it's realistic to expect something to change in Turkey, or do you think that this is something we just have to let the regime ride its time out and then see what happens?
No, I agree with your criticism about the structure of Turkish political parties, and it's in general a one-man rule. But maybe in CHP at least you can have some opposition in the party. In AKP you cannot find it anymore, but it wasn't the case before. They also had some opposition in the party. But in general, yes, in Turkey the leaders have the tendency to stay until they die, or they just... That's how it works in general, and they do not really step down willingly, or that's a problem, of course. Well, I don't know how we can get rid of this regime that we have right now. If I knew the formula, believe me, I would be trying to spread the formula in Turkey also. But what I believe is that we need to have a strong and solid democracy bloc, and which is going to have an agreement on some very basic points, and we also need to convince those people who are voting AKP that if it goes on like that, AKP is a machine which needs to create enemies in order to be in power. So they have attacked all their allies. They were in very good terms with Gülenists. They have attacked them. They were in very good terms with some of the Turkish liberals, and they got rid of them. And they were in good terms with some parts of the Kurdish movement, and they got rid of them. So they're going to get rid of some parts of their own party, because that's how it works. And I think a a coalition of democratic forces, including the Kurdish movement, the secularist movement, some of the Islamists, and those people who are voting for AKP because of the economic stability that AKP is supposed to bring Turkey, maybe in the first 10 years of their government. I think all those forces should come together, and maybe the presidential elections can help to form that kind of a coalition, because I don't think that the political parties would be very relevant in Turkey under the presidential system.
Gentleman back there, please.
Hi, I have a question about the reporting on the Gülenist movement, or rather what you believe should be the proper reporting. Now in Turkey, there's no question. I mean, the wording and the way that people and the media along what's left of the spectrum speak about it is a terrorist organization called FETÖ, whilst here in Europe, in the West, we still speak of the so-called Gülenist movement, the alleged mastermind behind the coup attempt. What is the right balance, do you believe, that we could and should strike between those two extremes?
Well, I personally, when I write about it, I'm using that FETÖ thing in parentheses, because I think as a jurist we still need to wait for a proper judicial decision about that. And I think when you're talking about the whole Gülenist thing, I think inside that Gülenist organization there were quite dangerous parts of it, and I don't have a lot of doubts about the appartenance to the Gülenist movement of at least the ringleaders of the coup attempt. And well, of course, we need to wait for the judicial decision. But when I look at the indictments, I'm quite convinced about the participation of some Gülenists in the most of the ringleaders of the coup attempt. They were Gülenists. And we also know from our previous experiences, especially in 2010, so early in the early years of 2010, and maybe even before that, there were lots of political showcases which were conducted by Gülenist prosecutors and the police. But I mean, I don't think a teacher who's working for a Gülenist school, I cannot say that person belongs to a terrorist organization. I think that person has got only sympathy for the Gülenist movement, and that sympathy was shared by the members of our government for a very long time. I remember when there were Gezi protests in 2014, Erdogan went to a huge meeting organized by the Gülenist movement and complained about the protesters to the Gülenists and saying that you are the ideal youth and those people in the streets, they are just anarchists, etc. So he was praising the Gülenist youth just only 3-4 years ago. And I know that movement has a lot of followers, and I don't think all those followers are terrorists. And I don't think it's a typical terrorist organization like the ones that we know, that classical terrorist organizations, but I am quite sure that the infiltration in the police and in the army is a criminal organization. That part of that movement which infiltrated into the police and the army and the judiciary, it is a criminal organization. And it should be dealt like that. But I think what is important is that my personal considerations is not important. What is important is a proper judicial decision. And for that we need a functioning rule of law, and we need to observe and respect the principle of fair trial. And after that everybody can its own, his or her own personal opinion about the Gülenist movement or its activities. That's why I'm emphasizing on the importance of rule of law and the fair trial.
Thank you. We have one question back there. The lady at the back first, please.
I'm sorry.
You're next, Michelle.
Good evening. My question is, what is your prognosis about the independent journalism in Turkey? Thank you.
Always in the terminal phase, I think I can say that. In Turkey, most of the media is owned by pro-government pro-government businessmen. And the mainstream media, as we used to call it, which doesn't really belong to the businessman who is close to the government, they are under pressure of the government. And what we call now independent media, well, like newspapers like Cumhuriyet and some 2 or 3 other more, they're under a lot of pressure. So we're not in a very good shape, and I don't know how long we can resist to that. So if it goes on like that, the last remnants of the free media in Turkey is going to be lost, because we are losing democracy in Turkey. If you're losing democracy in a country, you're losing also the free press, because they go hand in hand. So in Turkey, we got the fake news problem that everybody was talking today, but we also have the fake democracy problem, because Turkey is no longer a democracy. Because as long as you don't have the freedom of press, freedom of expression, that means you don't have a democracy. So, you know, there are lots of denominations, like they use it for Hungary, calling, you know, illiberal democracies or authoritarian democracies, etc. That doesn't mean anything. Illiberal democracy is not a democracy. An authoritarian democracy is not a democracy. So if it goes on like that, we should talk about that fake democracy thing, because on the surface it looks like a democracy. You got the elections, you got the parliament, you don't have your old school dictator, but it really is not a democracy.
Lady in the front, please.
Thank you. I need a question about sexism and transphobia in the press business. We are always talking about press freedom in Turkey all over the world, but the world is looking the press freedom issues over the selected people who telling about these issues. But we need talking about sexism, transphobia and gender identity in the press business in the Turkey, in the new business. But we can't talk about any time about these issues, because always we are making argues over the freedom of the press. You know, we have got a selected journalist people, and they are going to do outside the Turkey all over the world. Somewhere in Europe and Northern America and UK, and they are always talking about press freedom and against the government, they argues, but we need just talk about sexism and transphobia, because I can't imagine the future in the Turkey as a trans journalist, and I need a job and I need a work as a journalist, but it's impossible in Turkey, because the journalism is a male dominant. You know, when will we gonna talking about these issues? When will we talking about sexism, transphobia, and gender identity? Can we get this problem in the future? And what are you talking about this?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I think all those problems are interrelated. I mean, transphobia or sexism is also a social phenomenon that you see more in a country where the freedom of expression is under pressure. And they're all interrelated. For example, this Sunday there's going to be the Pride Walk in Istanbul, and it's going to be forbidden by the police. It's going to be attacked by the police forces. It wasn't the case, as you can remember. Also, 3-4 years ago, it was allowed. And in Istanbul, we had the biggest Pride Walks in the whole region. I mean, I'm not talking about Middle East, I'm talking about also the Balkans or East Europe. It was a relatively free country when it came to freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. And even, I remember an AKP booklet saying that okay, they're accusing us of being Islamists, but we led one of the biggest gay prides in the region, gay pride walks in the region. But, you know, with that authoritarian road that the government has taken, or accelerated that road, now it's forbidden. And why is it forbidden? We don't know. But since 3 years, it's forbidden. And that's why I think everything is interrelated, and we should not compartmentalize the right problems. Of course, that is a very important problem, and we are going to see the consequences of this problem this Sunday when there's going to be that Pride Walk.
Well, okay, we'll take one last question real quick because our time is up. One last question back there, please.
Thank you very much. Just continuing the question about diversity in the media, I would like to ask and understand if there are also problems because of because of less freedom of speech or not freedom of speech. The problems of national and religious minorities, for example, Armenia's problems, are also undermined and are also problematic now to talk in media or to raise any question about Armenians in media as well. Thank you.
It's true, and well, recently we had a relative openness about the Armenian issue in Turkey, and it was a huge taboo for decades. But last 10 years we started to talk about it and people started to learn about what happened. That doesn't mean that everybody who read about it just is convinced that it was a genocide. But at least people have seen that something happened there and that there was a real problem about the Turkish history and about our common history. And but that process has also ended with this government's decision to curb all the freedoms. And I was quite enthusiastic about that debate also at the time, because I was learning things, and the channels of dialogue between the Armenian diaspora and Turkey, or at least the civil society of Turkey, were developing. And I found it quite a positive thing. But now, I mean, nobody's talking about it anymore because I think the taboos came back to the Turkish political scene again. But I am sure that we have started talking about it a couple of years ago. I am sure that we are going to restart talking about it whenever the atmosphere, the political atmosphere, is going to be in a better condition.
I'm sorry, but we have to end it. Sorry. Thank you very much for participating. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.